All right, let's begin. All right, narratives of decline. We're at the penultimate lecture, second to last. It's an exciting topic. It was actually requested by one of the students, and I thought it was a great topic to do. Narratives of decline, the rise and fall of Islamic scientific thought. We still won't escape religion and science, but I promise you we're going to go in some different directions today. So necessary disclaimers, as always, these are just my views, do not necessarily reflect the views of the Ghamidi Center or Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. I'm affiliated to Harvard University as a PhD candidate. We will be taking an academic approach to the subject matter. But today in this lecture, we're going to do what I call diagnosis and treatment. What is the diagnosis and treatment of the Islamic decline? So this is a problem that necessarily involves a degree of subjectivism. You may not agree, you may agree with my diagnosis or you may not. And even if you agree with my diagnosis, you may not agree with my treatment. I'm going to put it out there since many of you requested it. So I am going to go out on a ledge and give my treatment, but you may not agree with it. So don't feel compelled to go along with that. And so on that note, my diagnosis and treatment are my own. And again, do not reflect necessarily the views of the Ghamidi Center. All right, let's do some quick historical review. So after the Prophet Muhammad passes away, part of Arabia is united under the Islamic rule. Quickly, under the four Rashidun, or the four rightly guided caliphs, the Islamic empire expands quite dramatically. And then you have the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate. After the Rashidun period. Following that, subsequently, you have the Abbasid Caliphate, which shrinks a little bit, but this is often considered the time of the quote-unquote golden age of Islamic thought. Now, it's important to note that it's really only 100 years that the Abbasid Caliphate stays united under a strong caliph. After a little bit over 100 years, there's some fragmentation that goes on, and then the caliph will turn into more of a symbolic leader, and there'll be these regional dynasties that will come into play. Now, even still, the Abbasid Caliphate throughout, all the way up until 1258, the Islamic world is doing pretty good. Now, at some point in time, we're going to talk about what point in time that is, the Islamic world starts to decline. And that's what the topic is today, narratives of decline. Once we were so great, what has happened? This, of course, this rise and fall has created a deep sense of inferiority complex in the collective Muslim psyche, right? We're still dealing with this question today. Maybe if we were never great, we wouldn't have this kind of inferiority complex. The question is, how and when did this downfall occur and why? And more importantly, how can we, quote unquote, reverse it? Now, there are many people who answer this question. We're going to see that this kind of the sorry state that Muslims find themselves in, we find that many kind of what I call pseudo-intellectuals will take stab at why we are in this predicament. And it usually, in their mindset, these are, anti-Muslim ideologues. Many of them are new atheists. Others of them come from a Christian background or a Zionist background, but they usually have some axe to grind. Here's Richard Dawkins, one of the leaders of the new atheist movement, and he points out, and this is a kind of a trope that they kind of reproduce a lot, is the fact about how few Muslim Nobel laureates they are, especially when it comes to the sciences. Here he's pointing out that even just from one college within Cambridge University, they have more Nobel Prizes than the entire Muslim world. Of course, he then says kind of, passingly, of course, Muslims did great things in the Middle Ages, but what relevance is that today? You kind of have this passed around about Nobel Prize winners. Actually, you probably don't actually see this diagram, because I think this diagram would probably cause you to pause and think that it's not just Muslims who are in this kind of sorry state. You see Buddhists, Hindus, really, I mean, this is quite silly that they're passing this argument, because it's really just a white supremacist argument under a religious guise. The Christians and Jews that you're seeing there, it's really if this is a confounding variable here, right? It's race and location, first world versus developing world. So that's really what you're seeing here. Nonetheless, it does still beg the question, why has the Islamic world fallen so behind? If we went back to 9th, 10th, 11th century Baghdad, And if they were passing out Nobel Prizes, probably at that time it wouldn't even be called the Nobel Prize, it'd be called the Baghdad Prize. You'd see a very different picture. So why did this happen? Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's also what I consider to be a pseudo-intellectual. He's a scientist who, for some reason, decides to get out of his lane and talk about history and religion. And he has this video where he talks about the intellectual collapse of Islam. I am going to play this clip, and today we're going to watch a few different things. So let's put this on.
I want to call something to your attention that we all know intuitively, whether or not you've thought about it explicitly. You go around the world and you find times and places where nations have excelled in one subject or another. There's a birth of that period of where they excel, peak, and sometimes it drops off, and sometimes they hang on. And so you can ask the culture of that. What was going on in that nation to support those discoveries? And then what happened when they ended? And so I call that sort of naming rights. If you were there first and you did it best, you name things. Particle physics in this country, in the United States, was like going gangbusters after the Second World War. And the discovery of atomic elements, look at the periodic table. There's berkelium, californium, we got half the United States up there in the upper, heavier elements of the periodic table. Am I right there, sir? That's not because the world liked California or Berkeley. It's because the work was done here. It's because there was an effort to excel in just those subjects. And it shows up in other ways. Well, I'll give you just briefly. Part of the naming rights is that you don't have to name it. So, for example, while we didn't invent the internet, we certainly exploited it here in America. We did that sort of first and best. And so your email address does not end in .us. Everybody else is in the world. They got to say what country they came from. We don't. Okay? It's simple, but it's the consequence of being there first and doing it better than anyone had done it before. Do you know that the British postage stamp is the only postage stamp in the world that does not identify the country of origin? Because they invented postage stamps. So why should they have to say what country it is? It's their invention. Okay? Check them out. It's just the facts of this. The constellations of the night sky. It's the Greek and Roman, and it's lasted to this time because they did a really good job thinking that stuff up. All the mythologies of the heavens, that really stuck with us. All right, so I'm going to make a larger point. Not to get gratuitous on you here, but September 11, 2001, as we all know, this was going on in New York City. The Rose Garden, or the Capitol, in an attempt to distinguish we from they, the terrorists who flew these planes into the buildings and into the, went down in Pennsylvania and at Washington, to distinguish we from they, he loosely quotes a phrase out of the Bible by saying, our God is the God who named the stars. Now, this is before I was on his Rolodex, okay? Because I could have helped him out there. The fact is, of all the stars that have names, 2/3 of them have Arabic names. So this was not, I don't think, his intent with that message. While the constellations are Greek and Roman, the names are Arabic, all right? And the list just goes on and on and on and on. And so where does this come from? How does this happen? How do you get stars named with Arabic names? How does this happen? And it happens because, of course, hang on, just getting over myself here. Okay, it happens because there was this particularly fertile period that Professor Weinberg duly discussed. And around that period, that 300-year period, the intellectual center of the world was Baghdad. Baghdad. It was completely open to all visitors, all travelers, Jews, Christians, doubters, which today we might call atheists. They were all there exchanging ideas. All of them. And it was that period we had the advances in like engineering and biology and medicine and mathematics. All right. Our numerals are called what? Arabic numerals. They ever stop and think about that? You know, who as in America, do we take pause at this? Why are they called Arabic numerals? Okay, they fully exploit the discovery of the zero, create a whole field called algebra, itself an Arabic word. Algorithm is an Arabic word. All this is going on, and it's all traceable, not to some long 1,000-year tradition in Islam. It's traceable to this 300-year period. This 300-year period. And then, so they had naming rights. The most expensive, beautifully carved astrolabes come out of this period. There's a great collection of these at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, if you ever want to check them out. So navigation, celestial navigation, all of this is traceable to this period. And so something happened. And what happened, as was previously described, I was told, and forgive me for repeating from what you might have heard, 12th century kicks in, and then you get the influence of this.
All right. Now he's going to lay all the blame on Imam Ghazali. We're going to come back to this and problematize what he's saying. But you see here that, to be fair, at least Neil deGrasse Tyson acknowledges the contributions of early Islam, although he, of course, limits it to a narrow 300-year window. We'll come back to this, and then we'll also come back to the person that he mentions, Stephen Weinberg. So here's another figure. Let's look at what Sam Harris has to say. Does everybody know who Sam Harris is? Sam Harris is one of the leading new atheists and one of the leading Islamophobes, I would say.
I always find it telling when someone is arguing about how important Islamic civilization has been to the career of our species, that preserving the work of Aristotle always appears somewhere near the top of the list. Let me just think about that for a second. Aristotle was great, don't get me wrong, but he's a single non-Muslim philosopher, and he wasn't perfect. He said many things that impeded the progress of science. I think his importance for future generations was primarily as a counterpoint to 1,000 years of Abrahamic religious craziness that practically ruined human history. And I count Christianity as the main offender here. Yes, it is true to say that a millennium ago, the Muslim world was ahead of the Christian West. But that doesn't say anything good about Islam. It's just a reminder of how terrible Christianity was. And as for the ultimate significance of Islamic civilization, yes, there were Muslims making advances in optics. I think Ulmer said this somewhere in his article. And one often hears this, but they weren't using these advances to build telescopes and understand the cosmos. They were using them to design religious calendars and more accurately pinpoint the direction of Mecca. Here's the basic fact that the Muslim community just has to grapple with. There are single zip codes in New York and Massachusetts that have produced more of enduring value, scientifically, artistically, ethically, politically, than the entire Muslim world has produced in 1,000 years. And if you think that claim is inaccurate, or that it contains a shred of bigotry, you are lying to yourself.
Okay, so by the way, I belong to one of those zip codes in Massachusetts. So you see now, compared to Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's definitely even, he's out and out Islamophobic, even though he denies that. He has this idea that all Muslim philosophers and scientists did was translate, preserve, and transmit Aristotle to the Western world. And there was also the idea that he put forward that Muslims pursued astronomy simply to build Islamic calendars and find the direction to pray. That is out of this mere ritualistic need, not out of true intellectual curiosity. And these are ideas that he's not making up out, these are ideas that he's getting from Orientalist literature, certainly outdated literature, but that's where he is getting that from. Here's what Robert Spencer has to say. Robert Spencer is even more Islamophobic. He has the website Jihad Watch. Basically, he argues that anything that the Muslims contributed was just them copying. That is, they were copying the Greek sciences, which were, of course, Western. So they didn't really do anything original. There wasn't really this golden age of Islamic science or culture. And even if there was, it was done at the hands of non-Muslims who served their Muslim quote unquote masters. And even if they were, even if we grant that there might have been occasional Muslims here and there, they didn't do it because they were Muslim or because of Islam, but rather in spite of their Islam, they did these great things. And of course, he's at pains to mention that none of this cultural or scientific flowering actually came as a result of Islam itself. In fact, and he repeats this point, it came from non-Muslims, or at least non-Islamic sources. He points out that Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Averroes, that is Ibn Rushd, were actually read and appreciated in the West, but in their own Islamic traditions, they were simply just anomalies, and philosophy supposedly wasn't even taught in Islamic schools. So they were aberrations. They were against what really Islam is. And then he also repeats that same argument that Imam Ghazali is the one who brought an end to Islamic science and philosophy. And here it's a lot of text, and I apologize. Again, I'm leaving a lot of text for you so you can refer to the notes. But basically, he's arguing that in Islam, quote unquote, capital I, Islam, there's only one understanding according to him. Basically, God's will is inscrutable, so there is no way to do, scientific the scientific enterprise. In his words, quote unquote, Allah killed science. And he says, sure, maybe at one point in time, for a very brief period, Muslims were doing some good things, but really there's no trace of that left anywhere in the world, certainly not in the Islamic world. Then there's Steven Weinberg, who was standing with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He is a Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist. He's an atheist. And surprise, surprise, he's a staunch supporter of Israel. That, of course, has nothing to do with his views on Islam. And he says, after Ghazali, there was no more science worth mentioning in Islamic countries. Again, we see a scientist speaking about history, getting out of his lane. And I say that as a physician who had to go back and do a bachelor's, master's, and now I'm doing a PhD. And I still feel, I have a lot of learning to do. And I would, I don't think it's right to speak out of your lane like this. At least not give talks and lectures to large groups of people as if you're some expert. Now, what I'm pointing to is the fact that history is written by the victors. And this is my own writing here, but basically this is my view of it and my experience of it growing up in the United States. Islamic history, if included in our educational curricula at all, is siphoned off to be approached as a separate and hermetically sealed unit of study. Virtually all major contributions to science, philosophy, and progress are attributed to Western civilization and to the great white men who advanced it. Everyone else is simply a forerunner or a footnote of history. Even if it must be admitted that someone from an alien culture advanced a certain idea, such a one is to be appreciated only insofar as he or she reflected our own Western values and Westernness. In any case, we, Westerners, are the ones who are able to appreciate the true value of this idea that this person may have stumbled upon. And the proof of all of this is evidenced by just looking around you. And really, that last point, I want to reinforce. That is all this is based upon. All this faux intellectualism, Sam Harris, they're trying to, talk, even though they try to speak intellectually, in essence, everything they say boils down to this last sentence. Just look around the world. Who's committing all the crimes? It's Black people, Mexicans. Who's committing all the terrorism and the violence? It's Muslims. That's it. That's the limit of their intellectual capacity. They just watch TV, whatever the media shows to them, that is the reality to them. There's no history. There's no real, analysis. That is what everything is based on. So as someone coming from the academy, my job is to complicate things, problematize such simplistic thinking, and go a little bit deeper. And we see again, history is written by the victors. Now, having said that, it is true that the current state of the Muslim world is pretty bad. I mean, if you look at research and development expenditure in the Arab world, it's 0.4%, even far less than Cuba. Pakistan at a whopping 0.24%, not even 0.25%. And the research output of the Arab world is really 1% of the United States. It's not just Islamophobes who feel this way, Muslims feel this way. This is a speech by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. It was actually translated by an anti-Islamic organization, Memory, but the speech, I think many of us would feel, we would connect with it. He points out himself that the income of the entire Arab world does not reach that of even Spain, which is one of the least developed countries. And that's the entire Arab world put together. And he asked this question with a lot of passion. Why? Why is that? I wanted to play this video, but I think we're going to run out of time. So I'm just going to give it in the notes. But one thing that he mentions in the video that really touches home is he makes the comparison of the Islamic community, the Muslim Ummah, the nation, as he says, he compares it to a bull that's going around a watering mill or in circles, basically, that we just go in circles and circles and we don't advance. And I think that really, connected with me. Here's, so we have the question, why? Why is this? why have we reached this state? We need a diagnosis. Well, one diagnosis and treatment that is offered is by reformist Muslims. And I'm definitely very sympathetic to this view. And I confess to once having it, but I fear that it may be too simplistic. And we're going to actually complicate my own previously held view and show that history may not line up with such thinking. Sometimes you have an idea and a feeling, but when you actually look into history and facts, you realize that you have to change your view. But this is an article written by Dr. Amir Butt, who wrote for The Nation, a Pakistani newspaper, where basically he says, Ibn Rushd versus Ghazali, did the Muslim world take a wrong turn? And he points out that many Muslims are asking why Muslim majority countries are so backwards. And then he points out that Imam Ghazali advocated using mystical methods, whereas Ibn Rushd, which we talked about this conflict between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd in previous lectures, but Ibn Rushd was all about science and logic. Ghazali was about mysticism and against science, supposedly. And so really the Muslim world took a wrong turn. And so, and Dr. Butt, which is, sorry, quite an unfortunate name, but he could have mentioned that Ghazali denied secondary or necessary causation, thereby on Ibn Rushd's view, undermining the entire scientific enterprise. This is at least Ibn Rushd's view. But again, we're going to complicate this narrative. This narrative is actually called the classical narrative. The classical narrative is basically this, that the Arabs were a desert people and they only began to develop scientifically when they came in contact with more ancient and kind of superior civilizations. And this classical narrative, and I fear, you know, it could be possible, I'm going to admit, that some of my lecture may have fed into this, previous lectures could have fed into this classical narrative. So I want to make sure that that's not the case, that you don't go home with a simplistic view. And this classical narrative basically has it that there was this one enlightened Mu'tazili or rationalist caliph who had and in this narrative, he even has this dream where Aristotle speaks to him. But basically, he begins this translation project in which Arabs translate and preserve the Greek sciences. And this sets off a golden age of Islamic science and philosophy, which lasts some 200 or 300 years. And ever since then, we've been in decline. And this decline started because of Imam Ghazali, who dealt Islamic philosophy, rationality, and science a death blow with his incoherence of the philosophers, which we have spoken about in previous lectures. Alternatively, or in addition to this, it's said that the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 led to the decline of Islamic civilizations ever since then. So these two reasons, one or the other, or both in combination, are given in this classical narrative as the reason for the Islamic decline. Now, there are many people who have a stake in this classical narrative. There are, of course, the Orientalists, the anti-Muslim ideologues, and certain atheists or anti-theists, really. The reason is they have this almost credo belief in this conflict between religion and science. This is the religion and science conflict narrative, where religion is something that's just based on faith, science is based on evidence, so they must clash with each other. Now, they apply this to the Christian world. Now, some scholars point out that just because it may have applied to the Christian world, you can't just take that model and apply it to the Islamic world. However, what I will say is that historians of science now, if you read the current literature, none of them will speak about this supposed conflict narrative, even in the Christian world. It's too simplistic. It doesn't work. So that's thrown out now. It's very outdated literature that these people are citing and relying upon. And really, they're not even reading the literature, let's be honest. Okay. Now, the other reason why they want to hold on to this narrative is to divest Islam of any connection to anything positive, and to limit any possible Muslim contribution to something wholly derivative in nature. That is simple transmission of Greek knowledge, which the West can then reclaim. So nothing original comes from Muslims. Now, the other stakeholder, as I kind of alluded to, are Muslim reformists, because this gives us a simple diagnosis and a simple treatment. We took a wrong turn by going down the Ghazali path. Now we can just make the right turn by picking up Ibn Rushd. Now, I am sympathetic to this, but I can't, back this kind of very simplistic narrative. And we'll circle back to this near the end of this lecture. Now, one thing to point out to kind of problematize this classical narrative is that, in fact, the Islamic scientific endeavor began before the translation movement. We talked about the Greek to Arabic translation movement. In fact, we now have pretty good evidence that this scientific enterprise began before the translation movement. And the reason is that as soon as these first translations are coming around, we see that they're extremely sophisticated. They already have technical terms for things. And we also know that these translators, many of them were scientists in their own right, and they were creating their own original scientific works. Now, we know from our own knowledge, compare this to like the Arabic translations that go on today, the scientific translations today. Can you imagine any of them, they are translating things into Arabic. We don't really see them kind of interacting and debunking the science that's going on, like, these speakers spoke of in certain zip codes of area codes of Massachusetts, right? They're not going to all of a sudden now start refuting Harvard professors, right, when it comes to science, physics, etc. So we see that that wasn't the case back then. They were already at this advanced stage when they started translating these documents. Even if we say that this caliph, who may have had this legendary dream of Aristotle, if he started translating these texts, the question is, what made him even think about Aristotle? If we study his life story, we read that he grew up with an education that included the Greek sciences. So we see that all this kind of preceded him. And he grew up in an environment that valued this sort of education. According to George Saliba, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he is a historian of science. So he focuses on Arabic science or Arab science, Muslim science, Islamic science. You can use whatever term you want. All of these terms have problems associated with them. I'm going to use them kind of interchangeably. But what he points out, and he's kind of the authority figure here, is that the evidence indicates that there was a class of people who were already in place by the time the Abbasids took over from the Umayyad dynasty, who were competent enough to use sophisticated astronomical instruments and to translate difficult astronomical texts. Now, he focuses on astronomy because that's his strong suit, that is his research specialization, but he says that this almost certainly applies to other scientific enterprises. So we know that we can't just attribute this scientific endeavor to the translation of Greek texts. And furthermore, he problematizes these transmission theories where we just want to explain the birth of Islamic science as a result of outside forces. He points out that these ancient books sat neglected and underappreciated and unappreciated by the Byzantine and Persian empires, from which the Islamic caliphs had to seek out these books. They had to go and seek them out. Their stories, even when they would conquer these lands, they would demand as tribute these scientific books. And that's how much they valued these books that existed, hidden away, underappreciated by those civilizations. So we see here that we're going to reverse this kind of claim and reclaim agency, that it was actually the Islamic civilization that was more sophisticated in its appreciation of these scientific treasures at that particular time. And these treasures, these scientific treasures, lay abandoned. And he says even for some 700 years before all of a sudden the Muslims began to translate them and realize their value. So it wasn't the case that the Muslims, and this is from his masterful book, which I'll show at the end of this lecture, it wasn't that they were trying to imitate this higher culture that was standing in competition with their own, that is the Muslims versus the Byzantines, but rather it was that they themselves had to dig out these texts that other culture didn't seem to recognize that they were important at that time. And another point that he mentions, and that's at the bottom of this page, is that that's why the Islamic scientists were focusing on these ancient Greek scientists and philosophers, and not debating or interfacing with contemporary Byzantine scientists. If the Byzantine scientists or the Persian scientists had been developing the sciences of the Greeks then you would expect them to be contemporaries to the Muslims, and there would be this dialogue going on. But the Muslims don't find that, and so they have to go all the way back to the Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, etc. And by the way, it wasn't just Muslims who were involved in this Islamic scientific endeavor, but also non-Muslims who are in this Islamic culture. So what's another problem with this classical narrative? Well, this kind of point will kind of hurt the reformist case, which is that even after the Mu'tazilis were swept out of power and a more traditionalist caliph came into place who even persecuted the Mu'tazilis, we see that, in fact, during this caliph's reign were the greatest amount of translations. So sometimes history doesn't support the view that you may want to hold. And so what I would just push back a little bit on is that even though it is true that the scientific endeavor preceded the Mu'tazili reign and certainly continued after it, the Mu'tazilis, especially that first caliph Al-Ma'mun, with all their emphasis on human reason, certainly all of this added gas to the fire. Now, Robert Spencer and a few others seem to point out that it was just non-Muslims who were involved in the scientific enterprise and serving their quote-unquote Muslim masters. I would point out that the fact that non-Muslims were involved in this endeavor, the scientific endeavor, Jews, Christians, and even skeptics, should be seen as a positive thing. It shows this inclusive environment in which the Islamic State is facilitating this scientific enterprise. Even still, I think it's important to point out that the vast majority of scientists were Muslims, and most of them were not just practicing Muslims, but they were actively men of religion. That is, they were Islamic philosophers, theologians, jurists, etc., often operating within religious institutions. I was surprised to read even that Ibn Taymiyyah, who is this kind of hardcore Hanbali scholar, he was actually a mathematician, so who knew? So this really pokes a hole into this, again, this religion versus science conflict that new atheists are kind of wedded to. It's a creedal belief for them, and nothing you say can falsify that belief. And that's why it's just something held. It's not a scientific belief or a historical belief of theirs. And I should point out, this was also true in the case of medieval, pre-modern, and even early modern Christianity, that it was men of religion who took part in science. For the great deal of history, there was not this conflict between religion and science. Yes, there were times in which religion and science were in tension with each other. Certain problems would arise on specific issues, but this idea of this kind of eternal battle between religion and science, this is just a fiction of atheists, or certainly of new atheists. And of course, I'm not trying to sweep all atheists under the rug here. There's certainly some very intelligent atheists out there, scholars and everything. I'm talking about this kind of on social media. Now, one of these figures, Sam Harris, who's a faux intellectual, he argued, and you hear this a lot, that Muslims simply got involved in astronomy so that they could figure out the direction to pray. This is a ridiculous argument. It's a huge stretch of the imagination to believe that you have this entire civilization that would launch such a profound scientific enterprise for the sole purpose of timekeeping or seeking the direction for prayer. I mean, if Sam Harris believes this, he's the most gullible person on the planet. And he kind of attributes this gullibility to religious believers. Now, he should know, I mean, he should really study some history and science, or the history of science, to know that astronomy was always considered the queen of the sciences. And that's the reason why the Islamic world put astronomy so high on, as far as it came to the scientific endeavor. And you see here this one Islamic scientist, he was an astronomer, but a polymath, Al-Urdi. He says that astronomy is so noble because it's studying noble subject matter, that is the heavenly objects. And also it's kind of the perfection of geometrical and mathematical proofs that an astronomer will observe. So it goes quite against what Sam Harris is claiming. Now, if there was any religious concern that really motivated this, one could say that historically, and this is not just in the Muslim world, in fact, the Muslim world might start being an exception to this, is that there was this concern with astrology, which is kind of a pseudo-scientific endeavor. Now, Even Ptolemy, who was the greatest astronomer of ancient Greece, believed in astrology. That's why he did astronomy. That is, they were looking at the heavenly bodies in order to help predict what would go on in the world around us. This kind of horoscopes. So this was actually intimately tied with astronomy. You couldn't. They were inexorably. They were intertwined, astronomy and astrology, in the pre-modern world. And it was actually, if anyone, it was the Muslim scientists who started to disentangle the two. And we'll see that it's actually out of religious concerns that they are going to do that, because according to traditional Islamic belief, astrology is something that is certainly frowned upon, if not considered forbidden, if not considered shirk, that is idolatry. We further see that the motivations are distinctly Islamic. Here's Ibn Rushd, who says that the reason why we study science is because the Quran itself tells us to reflect upon the universe. Because by looking at the world around us, we see the art of the great artisan. That is, we see the art of God, and we see how perfect and complete it is. And this mirrors the motivations of Francis Bacon, who is the 17th century figure who is credited as the founder of the modern scientific method, although we'll see that there's an Islamic figure who could arguably also take credit for founding the scientific method, at least maybe the pre-modern scientific method. Now, so it was not in spite of Islam that this science was conducted, but because of Islam. That is to say, this really wouldn't have happened historically if it wasn't for Islam. We talked about in an earlier lecture that monotheism actually creates the space to do this science, because when you were talking about a polytheistic culture in which different, and it's not all polytheistic religions, but it's certainly the ones that the pre-Islamic or pagans come out from, you see that it could be that different gods are controlling different parts of the environment. You might have a god who controls rain, for example, a god who controls something else. So monotheism says, no, there's only one God who rules the universe with a fixed set of natural laws. So you have this systematization of the natural universe under the belief in this one God, from which the universe comes. You also have this universalization that takes place with the rise of the Islamic Caliphate. You have the spread of the Arabic language, which is a direct result of the Quran. All these people are trying to read the same sacred text, and so Arabic becomes the lingua franca of this vast Islamic empire. All of these lands come together under this Muslim Abrahamic umbrella, and Arabic becomes the language not just for Muslims, but also for Jews and Christians. That's why you see Maimonides, for example, the greatest Jew, like he's the Ghazali of Judaism, he writes primarily in Arabic, as far as I know. Furthermore, Islam creates a book culture because it centers around the Quran. The Quran needs scholars of language, grammar, rhetoric, etc. And this fosters this environment or this culture of book learning. And so this book culture is what then seeps into all other aspects of life. And furthermore, you have this idea that you need to appreciate the beauty of the universe and the wisdom of the creator, as we saw in the quote of Ibn Rushd. The bottom line, this is the bottom line. The scope of Islamic scientific activities was vast. Science in medieval Muslim societies was practiced on a scale unprecedented in earlier or even contemporary human history. In urban centers, from the Atlantic to the borders of China, thousands of scientists pursued careers in many diverse scientific disciplines. Until the rise of modern science, no other civilization engaged as many scientists, produced as many scientific books, or provided as varied and sustained support for scientific activity. And I think we should be proud of this Islamic heritage. Furthermore, this scientific quote unquote golden age, it was not derivative. The Arabs were not merely transmitting to the Latin West, which is Europe. They weren't just transmitting Greek sciences. No, they were. So there was this idea that it's a modern idea. We kind of look down on commentaries. There's this idea that, oh, they just wrote commentaries upon commentaries. Commentaries really get a bad rap. As George Salaba writes, really, this was kind of their like we have the modern periodical system, that was their system of the day. If you wanted to interface yourself with the existing scholarship, the way you would do it is by writing a commentary. You were engaging with, and often you were refuting who you were commentating upon, or you were extending their logic, correcting their mistakes, etc. Furthermore, Muslim scholars were publishing original scientific works, and many of these were taken up by the Latin West and considered integral to the Renaissance and eventually to the scientific revolution. But it goes further than this. The Muslims quickly began an active program of correcting the Greek mistakes, of massively overhauling the entire system. The Muslims did just that, and the idea that the Renaissance scientists would want to just go back hundreds of years to rely on the outdated Greek texts that had been refuted by the up-to-date Islamic ones is ludicrous. And it would speak very poorly of not the Muslims, if this was true, but the Renaissance scientists. In fact, there was a whole genre of what's called shukuk literature, which is, comes from the word shak, doubt. So we have all of these, we have doubts. These scientists who are writing doubts about Galen, about Ptolemy, etc. Just to quickly review, the Greek sciences were based on, Aristotle we talked about. Cosmology was based on Aristotle and the overall scientific worldview. Ptolemy was known for putting forth the astronomical, the view of the world, which was, again, geocentric. And then Galen is credited for the medical aspect. So these are kind of the three great figures as far as cosmology, astronomy, and medicine are concerned. Now, there was this conflict between Aristotle and Ptolemy. Aristotle believed that the planets move in perfectly uniform circular motions at constant speeds. Ptolemy, on the other hand, so Aristotle just was theorizing, but Ptolemy needed to make astronomical predictions. He realized that the planets don't really follow Aristotle's rule. And so you see that there's this tension between theory and practice. This is going to become important because the Muslims, scientists, are going to be the ones who are going to try to resolve this conflict. Now, to get around this, Ptolemy himself had to introduce all of these complicated things to try to preserve Aristotle's kind of theory, but make it at least fit the reality of the practical observation. And so we introduced these things called epicycles, equants, eccentrics, and deferents. It's quite confusing. You can look at the diagram. Well, basically, notice that the planet is no longer in the center of the circle. He has to introduce all of these different things to kind of preserve Aristotelianism, but still be able to do observational astronomy and predictive astronomy where you're actually making predictions. Because you can't just BS your way through it. You got to actually say, okay, I predict that this eclipse is going to take place on so-and-so date. So that's verifiable. So you couldn't just rely on theory as Aristotle tended to do. Now, so the Muslims had this critical attitude toward this Greek material. They realized that the Greek sciences, they didn't really line up to observational data. And so this really produced a critical attitude towards the translated text. And you see this shift in Islamic science towards experiment over theory. Now, let's come back to Ghazali, because Ghazali is really blamed for bringing the downfall of Islamic science and rationality. Now, despite myself disagreeing with Ghazali's imputation of infidelity to the Islamic philosophers, I talked about this in a previous lecture, I do find much of Ghazali's discourse to be sophisticated, profound, and intellectually stimulating. And it's important to reiterate that Ghazali was himself a philosopher in the general sense of the word, but at least also in some ways in the specific sense that even though he technically wasn't called one of the falasifa, he actually absorbs much of Avicennan thought to such an extent that some Western scholars today say that Ghazali was himself Avicennan. Now that I think is too much of a stretch, but it is true that Ghazali was deeply influenced by the same people that he was debating with. And this is a common occurrence in history. If three of the doctrines of the philosophers were considered off limits and kufr, then what about the rest of them? The truth is that Ghazali absorbs many philosophical ideas, and perhaps even much of their overall framework, and imports them into the theological enterprise. And after Ghazali, they become part and parcel of Islamic traditional thought. Philosophy, therefore, does not die by the hands of Ghazali, but is rather assimilated into religious orthodoxy, at least to some extent. So again, Ghazali is the most influential Islamic theologian in history. He comes to define Islamic orthodoxy. But I think it's important to point out that when we read him today, he's often read through the lens of orthodoxy. And this kind of obscures many of his original ideas. I agree with the idea and the desire of many Islamic traditionalists to explore and reinvigorate the thought of Imam Ghazali, because he is full of all of his intellectual, psychological, and spiritual insights that would benefit us today. Yet I think this should be done in conversation with Ghazali's interlocutors to bring forth the full breadth of the vast Islamic legacy. And we talked about Ibn Tufayl, who was an Islamic philosopher, who kind of compared Ghazali's arguments with Ibn Sina's arguments, compared them against each other, and that's the way to truth. And I think that's a good model for us to follow. Now, coming back to the point, Peter Adamson, who's a specialist of Islamic philosophy today, he points out that this narrative of this downfall after Ghazali is just completely false. So he says, rather than offering you an explanation of this decline, I'm going to tell you that there is no decline to explain. After Ghazali, in fact, Islamic philosophy goes into 4 different branches. It continues under Kalam, under the title of Kalam, which is kind of scholastic theology. Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi is one of the big names that, unfortunately, I wish I could have spent some time on him. He was a very original thinker. He was an Ash'ari theologian. Ibn Khaldun is another great thinker on this line of thinking. There was Shia scholasticism, Nasr ad-Din al-Tusi, who is an Ismaili or Twelver theologian. He is someone that I wish I had focused more on. Then you have Sufi theosophy, or that's just a combination of philosophy and mysticism. And then finally, you have Illuminationism, which is Ishraqiya. This is kind of this idea of God being a light and everything else being a reflection of this light. We're not going to be able to go into detail of any of these 4 trends here, but the point is that Islamic philosophy is basically absorbed into these different groups, and then it goes in these 4 different directions after Imam Ghazali. It is true, however, that the group known as the Falasifa, really they do start to decline and disappear. So you don't see people like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, who kind of take the name under the banner of the Falasifa after Ghazali. So there is some decline in that specific way, I think. Now, it's not just philosophy that continues after Ghazali, but it's actually the sciences that also continue to advance. So the idea that it just declined after Ghazali is kind of ridiculous. Think about the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals. Do you really think there was no scientific discoveries going on at that time? As Adamson writes, those Muslims, he's replying to Richard Dawkins, remember, who said, yeah, they did good things in the Middle Ages. He says, those Muslims, they did do great things in the Middle Ages, and then they kept on doing them. So, and then he just again kind of points out that this terminal decline after Ghazali and Ibn Rushd is just not true. Now, if you want to explore Sunni religious thought even further, I would point you to this article by Abdurrahman, The Myth of Intellectual Decline. Abdurrahman did study at Harvard University. He was a colleague of mine. He's a brilliant mind. We fall on opposite sides of the theological spectrum, but I must say that he is absolutely brilliant, and this is a brilliant article, so I strongly urge you to check that out. He does push back against Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who talks about this decline after Imam Ghazali. I think we can be a little bit forgiving of Sheikh Hamza because this narrative is just so ingrained in, even in Western academy. It's only in the last few decades that we've really pushed back against this. So, and if you want to see the kind of mainstream Ash'ari theologians who are pushing Islamic theology and philosophy further, I refer you to this article. It's beyond my expertise. Now, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, contrary to what Robert Spencer says, does not die out in the Islamic world. In fact, all 4 strands that we talked about, Peter Adamson puts them under Avicennan philosophy. So actually there was nobody more than Avicenna who influenced Islamic philosophy. So this idea that Ibn Sina is this outlier and alien to the Islamic civilization is completely false. Now, Ibn Sina does impact the West through multiple sources, including St. Thomas Aquinas, who is the Ghazali of Catholicism, and he does influence Maimonides as well, who is also the Ghazali of Judaism. So you see that Ibn Sina had a profound influence, not just in the Islamic world, but also in Judaism and Christianity. Now, even if it is true that Avicenna's legacy is underappreciated by many modern Muslims, Ibn Sina's, and that's why I'm teaching this course, Ibn Sina's influence in Islamic intellectual history historically has been vast. In fact, Ibn Sina was read and furiously commented upon. In other words, the claim that he was somehow an anomaly to Islamic history is false. All right. As far as Ibn Rushd, Averroes, it's often pointed out that Ibn Rushd was not taken up by the Islamic world. That is, and it was taken up instead by the Western world, Europe, in which he was credited as the father of rationalism and even the father of free thought and unbelief. Now, Ibn Rushd himself was a deeply religious and pious Muslim, but somebody's thought can go in all different directions when it goes to another source and it develops. Now, it's true that Ibn Rushd's legacy in the Islamic world is much more meager, and I think some people do try to kind of poo-poo Ibn Rushd because of that, but I think that's misleading. Ibn Rushd was the culmination of a major trend of Islamic thought. So he was the zenith of this thought and not some sort of outlier. It is true that it declined after him, but that doesn't mean that it was some sort of outlier, at least in the first few hundred years of Islamic thought. Furthermore, Ibn Rushd was not rejected simply because his ideas were somehow crazy and out there, but rather because he criticized Ibn Sina, a fellow Islamic philosopher, and Ibn Sina's influence was so vast that that's the reason why Ibn Rushd didn't take off as much. And Ibn Sina was no less radical than Ibn Rushd. And it's important to point out that Ibn Rushd was, of course, picked up again by the Islamic world, by Islamic modernists and reformists. I do want to correct something I said in a previous lecture where I said that somebody had asked if who actually took up this legacy. I mentioned that Islamic modernists do, but I would say that it's few. I want to correct. It's actually few and far between. I would say that the problem with a lot of Islamic modernists, who I'm very sympathetic to, is that, and reformists and liberals and progressives, etc., is that many of them are disconnected from the Islamic past. They kind of come up with their ideas de novo, or they come across as one-offs. And that's one of the reasons why I'm teaching this course, is to familiarize people with our vast Islamic intellectual history so that then you can use that in creative ways yourself. I think it's important to be grounded in the Islamic past. Otherwise, you really have no leg to stand on, and you're not going to have credibility or any street cred with the general masses of Muslims. Now, I think this is a good time to take some questions. So do we have any verbal questions? I'll let the moderator. Okay, I'm gonna, in the meantime, while people raise their hand, I'm gonna answer a YouTube question from Ahmad. What would you say about the thought that science shouldn't be tried to be derived from the Quran in the way that some popular speakers do, such as Zakir Naik? I absolutely agree, and I would say that Ahmad Dalal himself, which is one of the authors I've quoted and the scholars, he also points out that really in the traditional Islamic thought, they did not derive science from the Quran. That is something that's done in the modern period, and I think that's done from a deep inferiority complex where science, even though they're fighting against science, in reality, in the back of their mind, they're so impressed by science that they feel like they have to validate Islam and the Quran through science. Whereas I would say that Islam, the Quran, operates, and I mentioned this in my previous lecture, I think it operates on a plane higher than science. And I think we belittle the Quran, and they're not very convincing when we take this quote unquote science from the Quran. So I'm definitely not a fan of it. Junaid, go ahead. Junaid, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you. It's excellent subject today. I'm really enjoying it. My quick question is, I understand that Ghazali may not have been the sole reason for the decline, but would you say that maybe the intensity with which he criticized the philosophers had an impact on the future scientists or philosophers, that dissuaded them or at least discouraged them? Would you say that?
So I'll put it this way. I wanted to say that. And then I went and looked at the historical sources and the scholarship on it, and the opposite is true. So we're going to actually show that that is the case. So I'm going to absolutely answer that question. So that's a great question. Thank you for keying me up quite well for that. We'll do one more question. Maratib, if you could make it short and sweet, that'd be great. Please go ahead, because I fear we're going to run out of time. Go ahead, please.
Guys, thank you very much. Basically, I just want to make a quick comment of decline of Islamic intellectual stuff in terms of it is due to the lack of spirituality and the rise in political powers. I think that made more vulnerable towards Islamic intellect if we could develop earlier. And the main form is the rise of jihadi type of stuff has been seen throughout the history, rather than purification, or people used to come towards philosophical way or the tradition of Islamic philosopher. That's my one comment. But the question is, I actually I will not rate Islamic intellectual history in the eye of Western philosophers or Western scholars in modern world, because the first of all, they have in a very different paradigm, and they cannot understand the historical perspective where Islamic philosophers were doing some great jobs, like you already mentioned. But we as a Muslim Ummah are very much failed in order to promote our work, like Ibn Rushd work or Avicenna's work, to the next generation. To me,
I want to call something to your attention. We all know.
Sorry, just one second.
Intuitively.
Okay, please, yes, if you could wrap up real quick. I'm sorry. Thank you for your feedback. Yeah. We're definitely, I think you're doing something excellent, which is you're giving diagnosis and treatment, which is what this entire lecture is about. And so I hope we can pick this up when we come to the end of the course. So thank you so much for that. So let's finish this this talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson.
And then you get the influence of this scholar, Al-Ghazali. All right. And so out of his work, you get the philosophy that mathematics is the work of the devil. And nothing good can come of that philosophy. That, combined with other sort of codification, philosophical codifications of what Islam was and would become, the entire intellectual foundation of that enterprise collapsed, and it has not recovered since. Over that period, all these books were translated into Arabic on a scale not seen since then. And so why am I even going here? Because I'm trying to explain to you that you fast forward.
Okay, so basically, again, to reiterate, the entire downfall of Islamic intellectual thought is put on the head of one man, Imam Ghazali. Now, I'm going to mention something. Beware of simplistic narratives. Any which way, beware of simplistic narratives. Everything is the fault of one man, one event, one strain of thoughts. This is something that when you start studying things academically, you realize things are usually much more complicated than that. Now, the key point that hopefully you picked up on was that Neil deGrasse Tyson claims that Ghazali believes that the mathematics is from the devil. So we're going to give Neil deGrasse Tyson some education today. Tyson claims that Ghazali believed that mathematics was the work of the devil and nothing good can come from that philosophy. I don't think Neil deGrasse Tyson even knew who Imam Ghazali was. I don't think he's ever picked up a single book by Imam Ghazali. Ghazali writes in his own autobiography, quote, "Nothing in the mathematical sciences entails denial or affirmation of religious matters, and that they, that is math, can in no wise be denied." And he further goes, quote, Ghazali is saying this, "Great indeed is the crime against religion committed by anyone who supposes Islam is to be championed by the denial of these mathematical sciences." Even in his incoherence, Ghazali, the incoherence of the philosophers, Ghazali specifically says that he does not oppose the philosophers in the mathematical, physical, or logical sciences. Quote, "It is only in the metaphysical sciences that most of the philosophers' errors are found." What is metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy whose topics in antiquity and the Middle Ages were about the first causes of things and the nature of being. If you're confused, don't worry, but I'll explain it. Meta means beyond, so it means that which is beyond physics, or more simply, the physical world. That is, it relates to things beyond this universe, God, the angels, etc. But more importantly, metaphysical questions, such as philosophical questions. Two of the most common is this debate between realism and idealism. That is to say, these are not topics that we normally, you and I today, relate to science. Remember, science now has kind of divested from philosophy. We're going to see that actually the Islamic world is going to do something after Ghazali, and part of it is due to Ghazali, that they're going to split science off from philosophy, and we have to give a lot of credit to Imam Ghazali for this. So Ghazali argues quite convincingly that many of the claims made by the Islamic philosophers do not reach a level of scientific demonstrative proofs according to their own rules. Because these ideas do not reach a level of demonstrative proof, for Ghazali, there is no reason to believe in them over and above revelation. To give a concrete example, Ghazali points out that the philosopher's idea that, quote, heaven is like an animal is not scientifically established. Remember, we talked about these scientific paradigms. According to the Aristotelian paradigm, the universe is like an animal. According to Newtonian paradigm, the universe is like a machine, remember? And that'll change again with Einstein. But Ghazali is wise enough to realize there's no scientific proof. So Ghazali is actually showing himself to be a brilliant mind here, in which he's actually able to step outside of that scientific paradigm and say, no, there's no proof that heaven is like an animal. And so this is quite remarkable, actually. Now, Ghazali himself makes sure to point out that, look, he's non-committal on this belief. He's saying that religion doesn't tell us whether it's like an animal or not. But even still, he's able to make that point out that you don't have any scientific proof for that. And now with the event of time, we've realized that Ghazali was probably right about that. The universe is not like an animal. In fact, from our modern perspective, it is the views of the Islamic philosophers on many such issues, such as we talked about this belief in the active intellect and the celestial bodies, etc., that seem to us now to be fantastical. Meanwhile, Ghazali is actually more recognizable to us as quote unquote scientific, at least on many of these issues. And he presages or foreshadows what Stephen Jay Gould talks about, which is this non-overlapping magisteria. That is to say that religion and science operate on in two different domains. Ghazali is therefore actually decoupling metaphysics and science, as well as religion and science, thereby making science religion neutral, just as we view it today. Religion tells us about these ultimate truths beyond the physical universe. Science, meanwhile, tells us the laws of the universe. So remember my point system? I'm giving another point to Ghazali. So it's 3-2, he's catching up. Remember, we talked about Ghazali's rules of how to interpret scripture. So basically, if scripture does not say anything about something, then it's a purely scientific question to Ghazali. So, but on the other hand, when it comes to scientific proofs, certainly scientific astronomical proofs, whoever decides to debate in this and thinks that it's against religion to believe in these scientific proofs, such a person actually does religion a lot of harm and weakens religion. If there's scientific, geometrical, arithmetical proof, If there's scientific proof for something, and then you claim that religion goes against the scientific proof, according to Ghazali, you're doing harm to religion instead of benefiting religion. If you tell a person who studies these scientific proofs and is scientifically minded that this scientific proof goes against religion, then such a person, Ghazali points out, is not going to suspect religion. He's going to suspect, he's not going to suspect science. He's going to suspect religion. That is, he's going to disbelieve in religion. I think this is the case today with evolution, that if you say that religion, Islam is against evolution, you're going to cause a educated, scientific-minded person to disbelieve in Islam, not disbelieve in evolution. This is my personal belief, but we debated about this in a previous lecture. Now, the second rule of Ghazali is that if so that's what I already told you about. If there's an indubitable proof of science, then scripture should be interpreted metaphorically or allegorically. That is, this is a rule of thumb that you follow. And he says the reason is it's easier to interpret scripture metaphorically than to reject matters that are scientifically and conclusively found to be true. The greatest thing in which the atheists rejoice. Look, this is why Ghazali is profound. It's like he's writing today in the modern. Ghazali should just make a YouTube show and say this. The greatest thing in which the atheists rejoice is for the defender of religion to declare that these scientific proofs and their like are contrary to religion. Now, Ghazali's third rule is that where science is not indubitable, and where religion is indubitable, in that case, you absolutely need to affirm the religion and what revelation has to say, even the literal interpretation of it. So Ghazali believes that these matters in which he's debating with the philosophers, those three topics that we talked about in the previous lecture, that these matters are something that do not reach demonstrable proof scientifically, and therefore we must rely simply on scriptural proof. Now, all of this that I've told you so far makes us think that really Ghazali wasn't this enemy of science, right? That he's kind of portrayed as. Furthermore, even though I said all those things against, I was very skeptical of occasionalism, and I was even skeptical of miracles. I was falling on the Ibn Rushd side on that. Remember, occasionalism is the idea that things don't, so Ibn Rushd was the idea that there's scientific causes and effects. When you light something on fire, the match is the cause, and the thing that you light, that is the effect. But Ghazali was talking about occasionalism, which is the idea that really these are just seeming causes but God is really the actual cause of these things. Well, Frank Griffel, a scholar on Ghazali, points out that in reality, an occasionalist universe will always remain indistinguishable from one governed by secondary causality. And Ghazali himself sort of points this out. And even the belief of in the rare miracle does not really undermine the entire scientific enterprise. Such a claim seems to be overblown, even though I'm sympathetic to the view that, I do think that miraculous and magical thinking, if you believe in a lot of it, it's definitely going to undermine science. But to believe in the extremely rare miracle, as long as you believe that generally, for the vast majority of times, things will follow a natural course, the thing that Ghazali called habit, as long as you believe in that, really you can do science. And there are tons of scientists in the Western Academy who believe in miracles and yet do science. So really the belief in miracles doesn't negate science, and any claim otherwise, I think, is overblown. And if you want, and the guy in the picture is not Imam Ghazali, by the way, it's Alvin Plantinga, who is a Christian philosopher, and he talks about how miracles do not destroy the idea of a universe governed by certain laws, or even if you want to use the word habit, as Ghazali does. And the way I think of this is, imagine if you had a holodeck, which is like the in Star Trek. Even if you were there every time something happened in that universe, if you had to press a button in order for that thing to happen, or you were a programmer and you simply programmed it into the system that whenever you did that thing, something would happen, whether you did it one way or the other, to the person inside that simulation, it would make no difference. That's kind of the point. So In Neil deGrasse Tyson's favor, he says he loves to being wrong, so he is wrong on this point, so good for him. Ghazali concludes, regarding the mathematical sciences, there is no sense in denying them. That is, you should not deny them. And in fact, I think he even includes it in the communal obligations, the fard kifaya, which he includes medicine in as well. But what Ghazali is heading in the direction of viewing science instrumentally. And I think that does kind of go towards a more modern scientific view. Now, let's compare that with Ibn Rushd. Now, I'm a huge fan of Ibn Rushd. He's my favorite Islamic philosopher, but I'm going to be a little bit critical of him here. Ibn Rushd was able to be critical of the Ptolemaic system, but the reality was that he was only able to do this because that Ptolemaic system contradicted his favored Aristotle, that is, his beloved Aristotle. Remember, Ibn Rushd was a pure Aristotelian. I think Ghazali was right that some of the Islamic philosophers were not critical enough towards the Greek sciences and were guilty of the same blind following that they accused more literal believers or the theologians of. As Ghazali put it, they were impressed upon, quote, hearing high-sounding names such as Socrates, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and they exaggerated about how brilliant those people were. Ibn Rushd and the Western, and this is the reason why Ibn Rushd was in Andalusia or Western, the Western Islamic world, because of Ibn Rushd's insistence upon following Aristotle, the astronomical sciences in Spain started declining because they just had to focus on Aristotelian theory instead of focusing on empiric observation. And so you see that ironically, if anything, it's Ibn Rushd, and it pains me greatly to say it, but I have to say, if anyone, it was Ibn Rushd, not Ghazali, that caused a decline in scientific progress, at least in this specific area of research, in this specific part of the Islamic world. So it's now tied. Ghazali versus the philosophers, 3-3. Now, post-Ghazalian thought, we're going to get into, but let's take a 5-minute break here now. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right, let's begin now. All right, so we said it's 3-3, Ghazali caught up. So let's look at post-Ghazalian thought. So again, we're just reiterating this point again and again that Ghazali is held single-handedly responsible by Orientalists for this decline of rational scientific thoughts. But in actuality, the 13th century that came after Ghazali was an age where new creative scientific thought continued to prosper. This was, by the way, after the sack of Baghdad. So in fact, the sack of Baghdad, which is one of the two reasons given for the decline of Islamic thoughts, actually opened up. So even though Baghdad might have declined, but that opened up many other centers of Islamic learning. So it did have some upside to it. And Salaba also argues, and he's the expert here, that that the post-Ghazalian scientists, especially in astronomy, but it seems in the other subjects as well, they were far more sophisticated than the pre-Ghazalian scientists. Now, this may not be anything to do with Ghazali. It's just the fact that Islamic scientists are naturally developing their craft. So you see this maturity, this maturation of the scientific enterprise, which is what one would expect. So in fact, you cannot claim that Ghazali killed science because science continued to improve leaps and bounds after Ghazali. In fact, it was in the post-Ghazali period that such scientists seem to have gained a well-earned confidence in order to even more directly challenge their predecessors and through them attack the main Greek legacy. That is, they had absolutely no inferiority complex in criticizing the Greek legacy that they were inheriting. Now, I wanted to point out that for the ancients, for the Greeks, there was this, tension, even in the entire pre-modern history, we see this tension between theory and experiment. And I show, if you've watched The Big Bang Theory, you see this debate between Sheldon Cooper and, what's his name? Leonard Hofstadter. So one of them, Sheldon, is a theoretical physicist, whereas Leonard is an experimental physicist. And you see that The theoretical physicist is always looking down his nose at the experimental physicist. This is exactly the same mentality that the pre-moderns had, that the Greeks certainly had. It's actually quite funny, but physicians back in the ancient times, the really good physicians, were the ones who never saw patients. The great physicians were just the ones who made grandiose medical theories. It was kind of lowly to actually give medicine to patients. This was kind of what the quacks did, or what the herb makers did, or the lower doctors did. So in fact, early surgeries were done by barbers. So, and that's why, you know, surgeons, you shouldn't really be impressed by surgeons. I say that as an ER doc, I don't really like surgeons, but in any case, the point is that the Greek sciences had a tendency of putting forth impressive but abstract metaphysical and cosmological theories, but they didn't do practical observational science, the empirical sciences that we now most closely associate with modern science. With Ghazali and several others after him, we see that there is this general shift from focusing on hi-fi theory to practical experiment. That is, that you get your hands dirty. This gives rise to the scientific method, which is often attributed to Ibn al-Haytham. Al-Razi, who was another famous Islamic scientist, he's actually criticizing Galen, who was where all Greek medicine came from, and pointing out that, and Al-Razi pointed out that his own clinical observations did not conform to Galen's, you know, grand assertions or theories. More important than Al-Razi's criticism, however, is the fact that he had his focus on method and practice. Throughout his works, Al-Razi stresses observational diagnosis of illnesses and their cures. Muslim scientists were thus separating science from philosophy, specifically from metaphysics, and thereby viewing science in a more instrumentalist way, as well as a more religiously neutral way. This allowed them to focus on method and practice, on experiment and observation. We see this with astronomy. So instead of focusing on Aristotelian cosmology, they started focusing on what they started calling mathematical astronomy. Instead, you focus on observational and predictive equations and that sort of thing. So this other scientist, Al-Shirazi, insists on the need to establish the science of astronomy without recourse to natural philosophy. That is, that whole philosophical, metaphysical, philosophical enterprise, and instead to base it on observation and testing. It's more epistemologically humble, this endeavor. Al-Urdi, another Islamic astronomer, explains the reasons for Ptolemy's failure. He says, I think that the sciences, in fact, even the crafts, are seldom found complete in their beginnings, and they gradually become more perfect. That is, the instead of first like sitting in a room with, you know, just imagining these grand theories and then trying to fit all the observations into that theory, you instead go out in the world and you observe the world around you, and then you use these in order to derive the theories, and it's actually a gradual process that you keep evolving. This sounds more like, again, our modern scientific endeavor. Thus, Muslims gave birth to mathematical astronomy, which focused on predictive accuracy and precision. Muslims also separated astrology from astronomy. They thought from a religious standpoint, astronomy was okay, but astrology, not so much. Now, many Muslims did do astrology. Many rulers were fascinated with astrology, but you do also see this major trend of going away from astrology in order to make the science of astronomy more respectable in the eyes of the religious community. So here you see Al-Razi talking about how astronomy is just about how the universe is ordered and not about what happens, not about horoscopes and that sort of thing. You see here that they're kind of foreshadowing this idea, which Galileo said, or at least he's attributed with this quote, that, quote, the Bible shows us the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. The way the heavens go, that's part of science. We see the same thing going on with chemistry, and hopefully my chemist friend is watching. But basically, you see here that even chemistry Muslims advanced. You see Jabir ibn Hayyan, who is credited for developing and perfecting numerous chemical techniques, such as crystallization, distillation, evaporation, calcination, whatever that is, and sublimation. Al-Razi was another major scientist. He was a polymath, but he also did chemistry. And he extended and built on the work of Jaber and established the subject more firmly as, and here is the key point, as a true experimental science based on careful and accurate observation. Muslims, by the way, produced soap bars. Yes, there was soap before Muslims, but we're the ones who created soap bars. Unfortunately, we never created deodorant bars, which I strongly encourage us to use. And he also did rudimentary classification of elements. Not the periodic table, but again, a rudimentary form of that. Now, it is interesting to note that alchemy comes from the Arabic word, and chemistry. The point is, though, that chemistry and alchemy were not separate disciplines at that time. So there is this tendency to kind of poo-poo the Islamic science of that day as, oh, they were just involved in alchemy. But the reality is, just as astronomy and astrology were connected, so were alchemy and chemistry. So it's not fair to knock Muslims for that, just as no historian of science would knock Ptolemy and say Ptolemy wasn't a real astronomer, right? So why do we do that with Muslims? But we do see that double standard. Now, as far as mathematics, we all know that these Muslim scientists developed algebra. That comes from the word from this book entitled Kitab al-Jabr. Arabs also developed trigonometry. So Arabs are not the fan, high school students and junior high school students are not fans of Arabs for this reason. Arabic numerals also, now, there is this idea that Arabic numerals, again, a tendency, both in scholarship as well as in the public discourse, is this idea that, oh, the Arabs simply just took numerals from the Indians and passed it on to the Europeans. Again, this is an attempt to show Muslims and Arabs as simply derivative in nature. But the truth is that it's the Arabs who developed and systematized the numerical system, and that was truly revolutionary. So I think Arabs should get credit in addition to the Indians, but really the contribution from Arabs and Muslims should not be denied when it comes to Arabic numerals. And we all know that we have to be by law either engineers or doctors. I studied both, by the way, so it's no surprise that Muslims developed and systematized medicine. Here are a couple famous ones, Al-Razi, as we've talked about, and Ibn Sina or Avicenna. And his textbook, as we talked about earlier, was used in Europe even until the 18th century. Muslims developed hospitals, and here's again that key point. They actually dealt with the clinical aspect of medicine. Ibn Sina, not so much, but certain other ones definitely did deal with the clinical aspect of medicine. So you see here that post-Ghazali, there is this focus, and it's not just Ghazali who started this trend, but of this practical aspect of science. In some, and the list goes on and on, by the way, optics, engineering, agriculture, you name it, Muslims advanced it. The first important consequence of this new epistemology, writes Ahmed Dalal, was to divest scientific knowledge of religious meaning and thereby freeing scientists from this burden of metaphysics. Science was then perceived as a culturally neutral or universal activity. Now, even this term, the Golden Age, if we're going to use this term, according to George Salaba, the true golden age of Islamic astronomy was post-Ghazali. And there was this thing called the Maraga Revolution, which is what Jim Khalili calls it, but we're going to talk about that. Basically, that was an astronomical observatory that was founded after the sack of Baghdad, by the way, and not in Baghdad, in part of Iran, modern-day Iran. But this is where these cutting-edge astronomy was conducted. So it seems that the sciences continued to flourish in the Islamic world up until at least the 16th century. So it wasn't 200 to 300 years, as Neil deGrasse Tyson and others have said, but rather it was some 700 plus years of the Islamic world that Muslims were advanced when it comes to science and this intellectual legacy. So I think that's something that we should be proud of. It wasn't just something in those Middle Ages, as Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris says, but rather it was at least, I would say, half of our history. Now, I think somebody did comment on this, and I am wary of this, but I do it myself. And there's a reason why I just do it, but really we should try to avoid the temptation of writing Islamic history as just being scientific precursors and forerunners to Western science. I do it specifically because I think it's important to do from a practical standpoint, but I do realize that philosophically it's not a very good thing to do. Now, on that point, so I'm negating the first point, the scientific revolution in 16th and 17th century Europe could not have taken place had it not been for the many advances made in the medieval Islamic world in philosophy, medicine, mathematics, chemistry, and physics. I agree with that statement. There was, in fact, this Arabic-Latin translation program. We always hear about the Greco-Arabic translation program, but we never hear about this Arabic-Latin program, or, at least I didn't study it in school at all. And we notice that several parallels can be made from the Greco-Arabic translation movement to this movement that took place in Spain. But Spain was not the only avenue of transmission. Italy was also a point of contact. Furthermore, another route of transmission was once the Muslims conquered the Ottoman Empire, they conquered Constantinople. You had these Byzantine scholars who fled and went to Latin Europe, which is basically the bulk of Europe, and that is how the Islamic scientific program kind of was diffused into Europe, one of the routes. Now, on this point, Robert Spencer will try to say, and he's an out-and-out Islamophobe, he'll say, look, Muslims don't have any contribution to the scientific revolution. If anything, it's only their jihad that led to a secondary effect of these Byzantine scholars fleeing to Western Europe. So he says these aren't really Islamic achievements, they're really consequences of the violent doctrines of Islam we explored earlier, that is jihad, in his horrible book. But George Salaba, he's going to destroy this argument. There's a lot of text here, but again, I'm leaving it there for you as a resource. And he just points out, I'll summarize what he's saying. He's saying that those Byzantine scholars who fled Constantinople, the reason why they were so advanced was that they were getting that knowledge from the Islamic scholars. They were direct points of contact between them and the Islamic civilization. In fact, some of them, and many of them, traveled to the Islamic world and came back and translated that knowledge into Greek. And that's the reason why they had this knowledge, which they then diffused into in the European world. So it's not just the case that you had these brilliant Byzantine scientists who, for some reason, they were the only ones in the Christian world who at that time had that learning. No, it's because of this Islamic influence that they were ahead of the game. So the point is that the Islamic learning was an important ingredient of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The Renaissance took place, by the way, I want to define some terms. So the Renaissance happened during the 14th to 17th centuries. There's some debate about the dates, but it was a period of this European kind of rebirth. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. But the scientific revolution took place in the 16th to 18th century, and it's said to have begun with the Copernican revolution. That, as you might remember from high school or elementary school, if you were a good student, is the change from a geocentric view of the universe to a heliocentric view of the universe. That is, that the Earth is no longer the center of the universe. Now, there is actually a Copernican connection, that is a connection between Islamic astronomers and Nicholas Copernicus, who was able to make that leap to a heliocentric view of the universe. And we see this based on the Maraga Observatory. Two of the famous scientists there are Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi, who we talked about, and Ibn Shatir. Basically, they were creating planetary models that were correcting all the mistakes in the Ptolemaic system. They were doing away with all of these awkward equants that had to be created. So historians now believe that the planetary models developed by at-Tusi and Ibn al-Shatir found their way to Europe, perhaps via Constantinople, and provided Copernicus with the inspiration for his astronomical models, which he then used to make that leap. In fact, we have damn good evidence of this. Here is Copernicus cheating on his homework. And if you're going to cheat on your homework, you should probably change the fonts, or at least change the letters. So we see on the left is Copernicus's diagram. On the right, you have Tusi's diagram, and he used the same letters. So for Aleph, he used A, for Ba, he used B, and so on. And so the points, if you're going to annotate the points of a triangle or a circle, you would just do them randomly, right? They wouldn't just line up exactly, right? But he's copying homework. He doesn't know. You're supposed to change that up when you're copying somebody's homework. But he doesn't do that. There is only one difference, which is the fa and the zain he mixes up. But that's because they look similar in Arabic manuscripts, the fa and the zain. So, but otherwise they match up completely. So you even see that he messes up when he's copying the homework. Now that doesn't take away from Copernicus. He was a brilliant person. But the point here is the fact that there is this strong Islamic connection. And it's only with the Islamic models of the universe that Copernicus is then able to make that leap to the heliocentric view of the universe. In fact, some historians of science call him not the first, who started this revolution, but in fact, the last Maraga astronomer is Copernicus, because otherwise you kind of view this as Copernicus just randomly, de novo, completely out of nowhere, just comes to this new astronomical model. There's no basis for it whatsoever. No, there is a basis from it. He's getting it from this, where the Muslims had kind of developed this theory, and he's just taking it to another leap. So this whole lecture was talked about decline, but we haven't talked about decline at all. What's up with that? Well, I do think there was a decline. The question is then, when was this decline? And what are we to understand what decline means? Well, if we're talking about scientific production, we see that up until the 16th century, the Islamic world, China, and Europe are pretty neck and neck. Europe is kind of pulling a little bit ahead, but really it's pretty neck and neck at this point in time. Oh, that was when we were supposed to have the break, but we're going to keep moving on. So was it the 16th century? Is that when things flipped around? I wanted to say so, and there are scholars who say so. Then I stumbled upon the book by Professor Khalid Al-Ruwayhib, who is a professor at Harvard, who was very near and dear to me. In fact, all my Islamic philosophy that I've learned is from Professor Al-Ruwayhib, and I owe him a very large debt of gratitude for that. He writes this book about the 17th century, and he says, look, we've been very bad to the 17th century, but in fact, there were all of these developments in rational sciences, dialectical method, deep reading in the Ottoman Empire. So this idea of decline in the 17th century is not correct. Now, I want to point out that it's no longer fashionable in scholarly circles to speak of golden ages and ages of decline. I've used them in these lectures because I am doing this to it's going up on YouTube. I agree that history is far too complex to allow for such sweeping and simplistic narratives, or possibly simplistic narratives. However, I do wonder if the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. Are we now saying that there never was any decline? Is my dear Professor Al-Ruwayhib the question is he simply pushing forward the decline to the next century, or is he completely bursting the idea of decline altogether? Knowing Professor Al-Ruwayhib, I think he's doing the former, but I fear that scholarship might be leaning towards the latter. It's just not fashionable anymore to speak of golden ages and decline. But then the question is, how then do we answer the question that brought you all to this lecture, that all modern Muslims have been seeking to answer? Why did they conquer and subdue us and not the other way around? Or why do they have so much cargo? This was, if you've read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, this was, I forget the author's name. Somebody's got to remind me his name. Professor Diamond, I forget his whole name. But he actually has a theory, and he launched this theory because he was visiting an island, and the people on that island, it was Jared Diamond, thank you so much. The people on that island who are kind of indigenous peoples, they had so little. They're kind of a tribal people. And one of them asked this white guy, Jared Diamond, who is this scientist, why do you have so much cargo? That is stuff. They were amazed by how much, equipment that he had, technological equipment. So I think we could ask the same question. Why do they have so much cargo, the West? Why don't we have all of that? So what I can say is, I think we can all agree that there was some sort of decline, at least a relative decline if we're comparing the Islamic world to the West. As mentioned previously, the scientific production of the Islamic world was just about equal to the West in the 16th century. But 2 centuries later, say by the beginning of the 18th, comparison begins to weigh more heavily in the direction of Europe. That is to say, we become consumers of science and not exporters. We become importers of science, not exporters of science. I also want to ask the question, do we really want to say that it was simply a material or militaristic victory alone? That is, they simply colonized us militarily. That is to say that there is no importance or relevance of intellectual history. That is, intellectual history is simply reduced to an effect and not a cause. I think that's a very meager view of Islamic intellectual history, and I want to push back against this. I agree, I understand that Professor Al-Wahib is countering, quote, the impression that on one side of the Mediterranean in the 17th centuries, one encounters the greats such as Galileo, Kepler, Bacon, Newton, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, etc. Whereas on the other side, there is nothing much. But I would ask, are there really equivalents of a Galileo, Kepler, Bacon, etc., Newton in the Islamic world during the 17th century? I read Professor Al-Wahib's book, and I did not see the equivalence of these. I would say we would not expect a precipitous drop in intellectual and scientific thought. Professor Al-Wahib's book could succeed in showing us that there wasn't a complete absence of intellectual activity in the Islamic world in this period, but maybe there still was a relative waning in comparison to the explosive thought coming from Europe during the Age of Enlightenment. And so perhaps, or perhaps the alternative, I think, is that we simply push forward this decline to the next century, that is the 18th century. But I think in the 17th century, and I think George Salaba was along these lines, but he says he hasn't done enough research of the 17th century. But I think probably the 17th century is when this decline or this relative decline starts to happen. And then it speeds up in the 18th and certainly by the 19th century. Now, Professor Al-Wahib does say that all this premise seems to be questionable. Why do we judge 17th century Western European scholars and scientists with how they, we don't judge Western scientists for if they read Islamic works of that period. And nobody asked the same thing of why Ottoman scholars don't study 17th century Chinese thought. But I would ask, would we really ask this question today? Would a Pakistani institution of science be expected to look at the West for scientific advancement, or to China, or to India? Now, China has certainly advanced in the last couple of decades, but take this question, if we're living 30, 40 years ago, would we really want Pakistan to look to China for scientific advancement or to the West? I think the reason why we compare it to the West is because the West was ascendant scientifically, and I think there's no way to deny that. Look at the Shanghai rankings, for example. All of the top 10, even the top 20 institutions are really in the Western world, right? Almost all of them are actually in the United States. That's why we judge the Islamic world in comparison to the United States. Again, this goes back to what Neil deGrasse Tyson said about naming rights. I think that's actually a worthwhile point. So I think this begs the question. Maybe it is that we should just be speaking of the meteoric rise of the West as opposed to this decline of the Islamic intellectual thoughts. After all, the rest of the world, including the Far East, also fell behind and fell under the boot of Western domination. Then I suppose the question would be, why did the West take off like a rocket and not the Islamic world? There are certainly material factors at play, and many of these scholars that I studied bring up these material factors. First and foremost is the age of discovery, and we can't deny that there was basically the West was for, lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. But basically they began exploring, due to Columbus, they explored the quote unquote new world, and they acquired new lands, they acquired new slaves, and this enriched them. And it's on the backs of all of this that they were able to fund the scientific endeavor. Meanwhile, the Islamic world basically became impoverished because now the West was no longer dependent on going through Islamic lands for trade. And so they were circumventing the Islamic world and going and acquiring all their wealth. So the Islamic world derived a lot of its wealth from trade with Europe, amongst other things. And the Islamic world didn't have any incentive to go west because why would they need to? Whereas Europe needed to because they wanted to bypass the Islamic world so that they didn't have to pay all these tariffs. So as George Salaba points out that wealth drove further that wealth from this colonial enterprise drove this production of science. Furthermore, he points out capitalism, the patent system, and this profit and competition-based science led to this outburst of scientific advancement in the West. The Islamic world, meanwhile, fell behind. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the gap widened between the poor and the rich. There were certainly other material factors that some scholars bring up, such as coal and the natural resources being depleted that the West was able to acquire from the New World. Jim Khalili brings up another idea, which some scholars bring up, which is the printing press. The Islamic world, the Ottoman world, was just slow in adopting the printing press, which made us lag behind intellectually. And this was just due to historically contingent reasons that we did this. And perhaps another scholar brings up the Islamic prohibition of interest as being one of the reasons why they were not able to develop. And these are, again, just theories. All of this points to that there were these political, economic, and cultural reasons for the decline in the Islamic world. And colonialism was a definite reason that further sustained and enlarged this gap. The point is that there were historical rather than essentialist reasons for this decline. That is to say, we have this view, and this is the reason why it's necessary to make this intervention. There are certain chauvinistic advocates of Judeo-Christian civilization, such as Sam Harris, Robert Spencer, who often portray the rise and dominance of the West as a sole result of their ingenious ideas and worldview, that is, of the Enlightenment, liberalism, etc. Conversely, the decline of the Islamic civilization is seen as something inherent to Islam itself, as if the seeds for its eventual and inevitable decline were already planted from its very inception. As such, I feel that drawing attention to such social, economic, and political causes, that is historically contingent events, including and especially the age of discovery, slavery, and colonialism, are necessary interventions to counter such chauvinistic and simplistic thinking. Even so, even if we agree that the Enlightenment was not the sole or sufficient cause for the meteoric rise of the West, would it not be too strong a case to say that it, the Enlightenment, had nothing whatsoever to do with it? You see here that, and this is a good point, that people who are not in the academic world, I think this is something that I learned when I was in academics, try not to make strong claims. The less strong your claim, the more likely you're able to back it up. And here I'm not making the strong case that the Enlightenment is the reason for them advancing. I'm simply saying that surely the Enlightenment, it's too strong a claim to say that it has nothing to do with their advance. Surely the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual and philosophical movement that championed reason, had at least something to do with the success of the West. After all, the ideas of liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and the separation of church and state helped to create stable governments and open societies, which allowed for civil society and the educated class to flourish, thereby creating the space for the scientific enterprise to grow and flourish. I think then we can at least recover something from the classical narrative that I've problematized here. Certainly, yes, I agree that the classical narrative is clearly simplistic and not supported by the historical record. Even so, I would argue that narratives of golden ages and of decline exist for a purpose. From a socio-functional standpoint, they can actually be very helpful, even if they are not 100% accurate to the facts. For example, this idea that we have of America being a city on the hill, this kind of exceptionalism that we have, even if it's not historically based on any historical fact, it does have some merit to it from a socio-functional point of view. Even this view of viewing history as something progressive, this teleological view of history that it embodies Enlightenment thinking, yes, it's now completely out of fashion in the Western Academy. Now we just have this view of history. Now keep in mind, so in Enlightenment, we have this progressive view of history that things keep improving. And we're going, it's teleological, that is, it's going towards kind of just better and better. And that all societies are kind of along the same trajectory. And the Islamic world is just behind the West when it comes to this. This conflicts with our traditional Islamic view, which honestly is a retrogressive view of history, where things have just gotten worse and worse with time. That is to say that the best of times was the time of the Prophet, then the Salaf, and then the first three generations, and then it's just been getting progressively worse with time. This is a retrogressive view of history that I think is actually very harmful. It inhibits you from being forward-looking. The progressive view of history allows you to be forward-looking. Now, most historians, most academics now take the kind of one damn thing after another view of history. That is, there is no pattern to history. But I think this forward view, this evolutionary view, this progressive view is quite helpful from a society viewing itself that way, psychologically speaking. I would say that if you are, for example, in the Olympics, and you think about the Olympics, once somebody beats a record, as soon as they beat the record, all of a sudden you see that record may have been held for years and years and nobody beat it. Suddenly one person beats it, and then immediately thereafter, multiple other athletes beat it. Why? It's psychological, right? So I think that these things have benefit. So I think we can reform, and again, I'm just giving you my diagnosis and treatment. You may hate it and throw it away. Feel free to do that. But many of you asked me to give this, so that's why I'm giving it. Now, I think we can reformulate or get at least a little bit of something out of the classical narrative, and at least save a little bit by saying that the idea of tapping into the resources of our rationalistic and philosophical past against the forces of dogmatic traditionalism that have now become dominant in the Islamic world can help reorient the Muslim mind to become forward-thinking and progressive. Finally, even if their absence, that is the Islamic rationalism and philosophy, was not the direct cause of the decline, bringing something back of their way of thinking, making it at least a tool in our tool belt, so to speak, could help us in our current predicament and bring about our own renaissance and enlightenment. No matter how we got here, I think we might really need to take an Ibn Rushd turn now. That is to say, maybe we've gone too much in one direction and we need a little bit of correction in the other direction. Finally, everybody asks me about, I got multiple questions about when can we and how can we have our Islamic Renaissance or Enlightenment. I think we use these two terms very loosely. Let's at least try to understand what these terms are. The Renaissance was a specific movement from the 14th to 17th century during which it was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth that was premised on this rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. If we wanted to import this into the Islamic world, which I do agree with, do you know what this means? This means that we should go back to our Islamic tradition and look at what the Islamic humanists had to say, the adab, the literature, which, by the way, I hope to talk about next week in our final lecture, a little bit at least, because it would be criminal of me not to mention it. But let's look at some of that literature, which, by the way, interfaces and Islamicizes Greek ethical and ancient philosophical and humanistic texts, Persian humanistic texts. That's what an Islamic Renaissance, if you're going to use the word Renaissance, would mean. If you're not going to mean that, then please stop using this term Renaissance. If you just mean a renewal of Islam, traditional Islam. Finally, the Enlightenment is a European intellectual movement that had to do with this. It's hard to define, but really it's the use and celebration of reason, knowledge, freedom, and happiness. By the way, the Enlightenment in the West was not an irreligious or secular phenomenon or an atheistic phenomenon. A lot of new atheists and atheists like to trumpet the Enlightenment, like Steven Pinker, who is another faux intellectual. He likes to posit this idea. In fact, recent scholarship has pushed back against this. David Sorkin, for example, and other recent scholars have argued that the Enlightenment, or at least one major strain of it, was in fact religious in nature. These religious thinkers championed reasonableness, natural law, religious toleration, and liberalism. Finally, if we're going to define liberalism, let's define it. I feel most Muslims have no idea what liberalism is. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. I feel that, before we get into that, let's just agree that currently the Islamic world is in a really, let's just say it's a really cruddy situation. The Islamic world ranks poorly no matter what index you use. Human rights, women's rights, We're 4 of the 5 lowest ranked countries when it comes to being a woman. And by the way, Pakistan is one of those worst countries to be in by these measures. So you asked me for my treatment. Many of you are not going to like it. Some of you are not going to like it from an Islamic, traditional Islamic point of view, and many of you are not going to like it from being super woke and, we have this left. I'm going to talk about this, but I think this book is a good book that I would refer you to. Farid Zakaria, he definitely has a lot of views that I don't agree with, and he can be a neocon sometimes. But this book, as far as the Islamic world is concerned, I think gets it right, that we should focus on liberalization over democratization. If we've just focused on democratization, but we saw what happened with the Arab Spring. Who did they bring in? They brought in the Islamic right wing. We first need to focus on liberalization. So let's talk about what liberalization is. We need a John Locke, not a Martin Luther. And liberal democracy must first pass through the gates of religion. Now, I'm not calling to a secular state, by the way. I'm not calling to a pure secularism. Rather, I would point out that many liberal Islamic intellectuals, whether they call themselves liberals or not, in the Indo-Pakistani tradition, Islamic tradition, have called for a third way option between a so-called Sharia state, which is what people are arguing for nowadays, and a purely secular state, which many of our liberals are arguing for. From Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, to Khalifa Abdul Hakim, who many of us unfortunately don't know about, to of course our dear Javed Ahmad Ghamidi, many of them have been arguing for this third way option. Now, as a Western academic, I would say that all of these articulations differ in minor ways, but really I would sum them up. Even if they wouldn't use these terms, I would say we could sum them up as being, and we're almost done, I apologize, just a few minutes over, as usual, I apologize. But I would sum it up as being a secular, or if you don't like the term secular, because that's been demonized and become toxic in our way of thinking, but a neutral state rooted in universal values and Islamic principles. This is a third way option that I advocate as our solution. Now, we need to know something about political philosophy. If we're gonna call this Sharia state, I remember when I was a youth, I was very impressed by Hizb ut-Tahrir, unfortunately. I had an older friend who I thought was really cool, and he was a supporter of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and they would call for, we want a Sharia state, an Islamic state, an Islamic caliphate. And I said, okay, that's cool, that's great, that sounds good, but what does that really mean? What are the details of that? And the reality is that they had no details. They have absolutely no idea what that means. They just call for these empty slogans. And the reality is that if you study historically Islamic political philosophy, as I have, you find that all it is Byzantine and Persian models of the divine right of kings, which is then superimposed, it's Islamicized, and superimposed on the figure of the caliph. That's all it is. Many Muslims seem to pit Islam, a religion, against liberalism, a political philosophy. Further, most of them only have the vaguest or fuzziest idea of what liberalism is. Worse yet, the Islamic right wing has successfully demonized liberalism to such a great extent that they have made the word absolutely toxic, just as they have done with terms like modernism, reformism, etc. But surely you should at least understand something before rejecting it offhand. So I'm going to give you what liberalism is in a nutshell. These are kind of the principles and values of liberalism: liberty, equality, fraternity. I can't describe it any better. Now, I would say none of these ideas are alien to Islam, to the Quran. If you look at the Quran, liberty, on my work on jihad that I work on my dissertation, I argue that liberty, religious liberty, is the crux of jihad in the Quran, that it's because the Arab pagans denied that to the Muslims that the Quran comes out against the pagans, and that's the reason. So liberty is central to, and religious liberty in specific. Equality, we all know that equality and egalitarianism, that we were all created from Adam, this is a part of the Quranic discourse. And finally, fraternity, Islamic brotherhood, come on, sisterhood, this is essential. Are any of these three things alien to Islam? I would argue no. Now, this is my confessional work, my constructive academic theological work that I'm interested in doing of articulating Islamic liberalism. You may hate it, find it anathema, but again, you asked me for my solution, so I'm giving it to you. Now, liberalism, these are the values that liberalism holds on to: individual sovereignty, egalitarianism, rule of law, non-authoritarianism, constitutional government with limited powers, guarantee of civil and political liberties, progressivism, universalism, and tolerance. What do you find so upsetting or un-Islamic? Freedom of thought and religious expression. This is key to religious liberalism, along with an emphasis on reason. I argue that this is in our Islamic tradition, as we've talked about in this course, and it's also inherent to the Quran. Liberalism is unfortunately often confused with or conflated with libertinism. And yes, there is a form of liberalism that is libertine, and that is what we have nowadays in the United States. Definitely after the 1970s, after the sexual revolution, we've now gone into libertinism. But this is not the same as liberalism. And it's not what the founding fathers of the United States founded this nation on. In fact, the founding fathers had ideas of religion that were very similar to the ideas of the Islamic philosophers, where religion was essential to the social functioning of the state, of the society, sorry. And if you want a good case for Islamic liberalism, this is a great book by Mustafa Ekyal. It's a quick read. You can read it. I read it on a plane. It is written by a journalist. So there are some mistakes that I wish he had had an academic scholar review it, but they're minor and they don't detract, I think, from the actual case being made. Finally, I would argue that there are two strands of liberalism. Mustafa Ekyal follows classical liberalism, which in America, the two political parties, Republican and liberal and Democrats, are both proponents of Western liberalism. They're different in which strand of liberalism they follow. So Ekyal follows classical liberalism, which what we call in America conservatism or libertarianism, depending on which substrain you follow. I subscribe to modern liberalism, which is has a focus on civil liberty and equality with support of social justice and a mixed economy, which today we would call a liberal or a progressive. So this is what I would argue we need to argue for. And I would argue that these Islamic thinkers that come from Indo-Pakistan have argued for this. It's the welfare state that we talk about. What Imran Khan has talked about, the welfare state, that's what is in our Pakistani and Indo-Pakistani heritage. And this debate, by the way, between these two strands, Robert Nozick and John Rawls, and they actually died on this, they taught at the same campus and they died in the same year, which is interesting. And they were friends, by the way. But I follow John Rawls, not Nozick, and I think Ekyal would follow Nozick. Now, so my diagnosis. In the modern period, Muslims have gravitated towards either political Islamism, that is a Sharia state, or extreme leftism, that is socialism, communism, Marxism, etc., the latter of which has often involved secular atheism. Modern liberalism, on the other hand, has never even been given a fighting chance. Look at the world. What I would say is look at the world around you and see which countries are successful and which have been utter failures. If you want to give a Sharia state as an example, give me one example of a successful Sharia state. Saudi Arabia, oh no, that's not a true Sharia state. Okay, the Taliban, nope, that's not a true Sharia state. Pakistan, when it became a Sharia state, nope, that's not it. You could go down the list. ISIS, no. Every example that you give, a proponent of a Sharia state will tell you that's not a legitimate example. Every example of a Marxist or communist state, China, Soviet Union, every single example, they will say, no, that's not a real example. So it's a non-falsifiable statement that you're making. Meanwhile, if you ask me about a modern liberal state, I can give you tons of examples. And the perfect example I would give you is the Northern European or the Scandinavian model, which is the model that I think the Indo-Pakistani thinkers are talking about, which is the welfare state. So I think if you're going to look for a solution, don't look to tread a new path when there's already a path that has been very successful for many countries. I would argue that a modern liberal state, which is rooted in universal values and Islamic principles, and which is religion-friendly and actively promotes religiosity without state coercion, would be an attractive option to many Muslims. Finally, the disclaimer I would make is none of this is to take a completely naive view and to deny the dark side of the Enlightenment and liberalism, which historically and currently has been associated with neocolonialism and racism. Whereas critics see this dark side as intrinsic to and inextricable from the liberal enterprise, I do not see them as any more intrinsic or inextricable from liberalism than violence and slavery have been from Islam and the Islamic tradition. The proof is in the pudding. For all the terrible things that have taken place with Muslims in the United States, the war on terror, the Patriot Act, Trump, I'm here able to give you this lecture when I'm not able to give this lecture in many Muslim countries. I would be hounded for this. Similarly, Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, he relocated here from Pakistan. This is proof in the pudding. I had a friend, and I'm about to end, I apologize, just a couple more minutes. I had a friend who is I love his work. He is a Marxist in Pakistan, and he's an academic, and I love him, and he does great work. But he visited the United States to give a lecture which was critical of Western liberalism. And I asked him how he liked his trip to America, and he loved it. I think that should tell you something, that you couldn't give such a lecture critical of China in China, but you can do that in the United States. That should tell you something about liberalism. And I realize, of course, that Black Americans or indigenous peoples would not feel so warm and fuzzy about the American experience, and I appreciate that. Finally, I just want to give you a specific roadmap since you have asked me for this. I think we can take specific steps to undo and revive Islamic intellectual discourse. The specific measure that we can do, and this is kind of what I want to do as my life goal, is to establish an Islamic divinity school and then develop Islamic academic theology, which combines traditional Islamic learning and the Western critical method. You have seen a little bit of that in this class. I even think we should follow the Deobandi and Saudi model, the Wahhabi model, which has been highly successful in spreading their strains of Islamic theology and philosophy, or theology really. What they do is they have certain institutions in Saudi Arabia, and they get students from all over the world. They give them full tuitions, and then their only obligation is that they need to travel to they need to go back to their country of origin, and then they spread Wahhabi ideology from that in that way. That's ingenious and highly successful. Now, could the Ghamidi Center establish such an institution? I do know that they have ideas and plans to do that, and I hope I can help them to do that. But I do think that in order for it to be successful, it should be interdenominational, liberal, reformist, critical, anti-traditionalists, and women-friendly. That is to say, it has to be explicitly these things. Otherwise, it will just be another Islamic seminary, and we have many of them that have been established in the West today. It has to have these as a mission statement. Furthermore, I would argue that the danger we have is that Ghamidi Sahib is such an amazing person. He truly is. I mean, he's a star. He's a superstar. But the problem with superstars, and we saw that with Ibn Sina, and with Aristotle, when you have such superstars, people can fall into Aristotelianism, Avicennanism, and then we could have, as people are accused of being Ghamidites. Don't be a Ghamidite. That goes against what Ghamidi Sahib wants. I've talked to Ghamidi Sahib. He's the most open-minded man. He wants people to just study everything and come to your own conclusions. So it's absolutely essential that if a center like this is established, that we don't just study the Farahi school and Ghamidi's thought, but we open this up to all liberal reformist Islamic thought. One institution like this has the possibility to absolutely change the world in my mind. I'm confident that we can snag at least a significant percentage of the educated Muslims living in the West. That's a starting place. This presence will shift the Overton window, the theological window, to the left. That's the end of my diatribe. Here are a list of books that I recommend. We've talked about most of these. I hope to get into some Islamic political thought in the next lecture, but I'll see you in our next and last class. We're going to take questions and answers. I'm not leaving yet. So if whoever wants to stay behind for 10, 15 minutes, please feel free, because I do know that this was controversial and we may want to get into a boxing match, which I enjoy. But our next and last class is on Tuesday, June 30th. I think tentatively I'm titling it as What is Islam? And that will hopefully tie in all of the lectures, and I want to discuss that. Join our Google Classroom. I know I've been behind on deep dive videos. I hope to churn those out at least after the lecture course is done. All right, let's take some last questions. So does anybody have any verbal questions? I'm sure you do, or feedback, please go ahead, and I'll see from my WhatsApp as well. Okay, somebody had a question: what allowed Europeans to move towards colonialism first? I mean, I think in order to do colonialism, you need to have the technological power to do that. So I think we need to appreciate that, even if we're not going to be appreciative of them actually doing colonialism. And the fact is that, you know, our armies were trying to conquer Vienna, and I think it was the 17th century. So I don't think we can be hypocritical on this. All right, Junaid Saab, please go ahead.
Thank you again. Wonderful lecture. Quick question. I do tend to agree with you about revival of Islam or Muslims would happen by going through this liberalism as you define or as you state. But I think that because of the fact that liberalism has had such a negative connotation, do you think we'll have to come up with some new term to attract some of the people? Because otherwise it carries its negative baggage with it. Your thoughts on that, please.
That's an excellent question. I got asked that question just in the last couple of weeks by my father, who's a very smart man, and also by Mufti Abu Layth, who's thinking these things as well. What I would say is this, and I do want to point out that Ghamidi Saab himself has said about liberalism the following, that I don't call what I do liberalism, and I'm not informed by liberalism. I just follow what Islam says. If that matches up with liberalism, then good and well. And what I'm here to argue is that I think a lot of what he says does match up with liberalism. And that's why but unlike Ghamidi Saab, I do call myself an Islamic liberal in the technical sense of the word. And I differentiate that from libertinism. Now, as to your question, what I would say is, I agree with you, it's become a toxic word. However, I think we need to appropriate this word. This is my viewpoint. I think we need to appropriate this word and use it so much and make it into a good word. And what I will tell you is that the religious right wing, our opponents, the traditional conservatives, they will never like us no matter what words we use to describe ourselves. They will always attack us. They will always try to. Ghamidi Saab doesn't use the word liberal. Do they like Ghamidi Saab, or did they run him out of the country? Did they start inventing words for Ghamidi Saab, saying he's a Ghamidite, he's this, he's that? I think we should just take the word up ourselves. And we have historical examples where people have reappropriated words. Now, for example, and this, let's not get into this controversial topic, but even the word gay was a negative word in America. The gay movement adopted and appropriated this term, and it's no longer has that negative connotation. And that's a movement that was highly successful in changing the entire Overton window in the United States. Even the word liberal today and the word progressive in the United States is a bad word in certain states. The fact of the matter is, no matter what word you use, the conservatives are going to demonize it. I think we should be a little bit more confident in ourselves and redefine our terms and go with it. That's my viewpoint. And if we use a label, the advantage of that, in my view, is that we get clarity about our own vision. And that makes us more cohesive. And so that's why I think it's important to use that. So I was able to articulate to you what my ideology was by using that label. So that, and as far as political philosophy, it's super important because we're not going to be able to progress with political philosophy unless we go in this direction of being clear about our terms and ideology or political philosophy. Any other questions, please? That's a great question, though, and you may disagree on that, and you're free to do that. I just think that we should use academic terms and embrace them. That's my view.
No, I do agree with that. The only thing was I was thinking rather than using a lot of our energies in overcoming this inertia or drag to focus more on actually getting more and more people involved into this program. That's why I was suggesting that. But you have a point. I mean, I think we'll have to look at that.
I understand what you're saying. What I would say is this: for me personally, I don't think that anything I say will ever appeal to. I'm going to be frank. I'm a little, as Islamic philosophers, I'm a bit liberal elitist in the sense that I don't think the chaiwala in Pakistan is going to follow me. I mean, or listen to any of my ideas. I'm specifically looking to you guys, the intellectual elite. That's what I'm calling. So I am egalitarian in one way. I'm expanding who we're talking about, the intellectual elite. I think the Muslim educated class, the technocrats, these are our target audience. And I think if you tell these people what these terms mean, just like I did right now, I think many of you had a bad idea of what liberalism is. And just by a few slides and me explaining myself, maybe I've changed some of your view on what liberalism is. So I think that that's what we should do, and we shouldn't worry about being so fearful. Now, I have the luxury of sitting in the West. I'm only talking about the strategy in the West. In the Islamic world, I think you might have to go a different route, but I think we can start in the West because we have the safety in the West, that we can actually express our ideas without our heads being cut off. So that's why I'm happily and easily able to use these terms. But I see what you're saying. All right. Any other questions, please? Or comments even. You can just have comments. Any pushback, any condemnations of takfir, please. Make it fun. All right, if that's it, last chance, countdown. Oh, we got one.
I was just thinking that, you know, when I hear you, it really resonates with me, and I feel as if this is sort of what many of us are silent majorities, and perhaps the technocrats have been thinking, and yet we've been sort of silenced by the experts, shall we say, the ulema, the sheikhs, the shuyukh, who are and I think it's really important what you're doing, which is creating the framework through an academic study, so that to really articulate what I think the silent majority has been feeling and thinking, but not able to articulate as well as you've done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are very kind words. And what I would say is this, is that the problem is that most more liberal-minded, open-minded, reformist types of Muslims, unfortunately, don't have the knowledge of the Islamic tradition to battle and go toe-to-toe with the right wing, the religious right wing.
Exactly.
Because they are mullahs, they're trained in that. And they have great training, by the way, from the tradition standpoint. It's a narrow vision of the tradition, but they're very well trained in it. Right. And I was talking to Ghamidi about that, and he said it himself. And I told him, I was like, you're one person who can go, you can watch him debating mullahs, and he goes toe to toe with them and can destroy them, actually. And the reason why is because he knows the Islamic tradition. So, and that's why Ghamidi Sahib is very special. And he told me himself, when I met him, he said that you need to know the tradition in order to critique it. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give these tools to you so that you're able to go with them. But then conversely, what someone like me needs is public support. I need the support of the technocrat class, this class. So if there's a billionaire out there, give me a couple million, I'll found an institution, we'll do this. But that's the only way that maybe we got to crowdfund, and this is kind of the path that I'm looking to. And it's not just me, of course, that's very arrogant to say that. There are actually many Muslims, even in the Western Academy, and we whisper with each other. I've met several of them about creating this new category of Islamic academic theology. So, it's in the whispering stage right now, but we need to go beyond that. And so I think founding that institution is absolutely necessary. But we need the funds for that. We're not, we give all these funds for humanitarian things, which is great, but we don't do funds for educational institutions or think tanks. And when we do that, we send them to institutions that, are Islamic institutions, but do they line up with our values? Do they have women scholars? Do they have women-friendly scholars? Do they have our values? No, they often don't. So, and they're often founded by people who studied in the Islamic world, which is great and fine, but then they just reproduce that, and they honestly just sterilize it a little bit and bring it to the West. And that's not really what I think we need or want, at least not most of us. And I'm not saying to eliminate those groups, but we need at least a counterweight to what they are doing. Okay, I think that'll bring an end unless somebody has one last dying thing to say.
I just want to quickly say that I hope we could continue this discussion after the class. Like you just said, this group of people are the people who are interested in, what you're talking about. So maybe continue these discussions in a non-lecture based class, in a completely discussion based, not class in that way, but kind of a coffee hour type of thing. That would be awesome. Virtual coffee hour, of course. But yeah, just a quick comment.
I think that's a great idea, Omar. Thank you for all your participation. I know I owe you an email. I apologize for that. But I really appreciated your presence in this class. Thank you for that. I think we can continue doing that right now. Anyone who has to leave can leave, and we can just continue a conversation. But other than that, after this class is completely finished, we can probably meet and do something, a virtual coffee hour. I think that's a great idea, where it will not be me leading the discussion, but all of you. And then I do have a question from Sister Numera. Where do the awam come in this picture, in this journey? Would it be our responsibility to educate them? I would say that historically, if we study the Islamic history, the awam, to be honest, to be frank with you, the awam have been our enemy. That's for being very frank with you. The awam have always supported the Hanbali, like the hardcore traditionalists. You see that the awam is what the Hanbalis use they rile them up, and then they get them to go do their dirty work. And so we see that even today in Pakistan, for example, you see that Mufti Taqi Usmani has said that anybody who blasphemes the prophets, if they go out and somebody else goes and kills that person, then what they did was, I don't approve of it, but if you do it, I think what you did is you're going to get reward for it in the next life, because you had a good intention. Well, that's giving a wink and a nod to the awam, the right wing, to do what they want to do. The awam is the one who elected Trump. The awam is the one who, I'm an elitist, I admit, and you may not be. You may be a populist. But I think traditionally Hanbalism has been populist, whereas the Islamic intellectual class, the rationalists and philosophers have usually been intellectual elitists. And that just has matched with my experience. And awam, yes, it means the hoi polloi, the masses, the throngs of people. I think they will change much later. If you look at the death penalty in Europe, the death penalty did not get changed by convincing the awam. It got changed because a dedicated group of liberals changed it at the highest level. And then that caused a sea change in the viewpoints of the awam after they realized, oh, wow, this has changed criminality completely. Our rates of criminality have dropped. And now we know, so that's how I think it will happen. And I think the mullahs will be the last people to come on board. The mullahs come on board once the idea has reached such a point that they can no longer buck it anymore. So for example, when it came to slavery and the abolition of slavery, the ulama class were the last people. They dug their heels in when it came to slavery and said it's a part of Islam. Meanwhile, it's the liberal intellectuals who moved, the Islamic reformists, who moved the dial on this. And then the awam followed. And then once it became no longer tenable for them to back slavery, then all of a sudden they said, yeah, Islam has always been against slavery. And then they even wrote a letter that said that there's ijma against slavery. So I don't think that reform will come from the ulama. I don't think it'll come from the masses. I think it comes from the intelligentsia, the religious intelligentsia. So that's what I believe.
What do you think, the idea that especially the Salafis have really pushed hard on any bid'ah, innovation being sort of antithetical to just our whole iman. I mean, remember when I'd mentioned to someone I was taking this particular class and they said, oh, you should strengthen your iman before you take this class. So somehow, which to me is really so against the Quran, because, the Quran says over and over again, so look at our signs, think. And those, the signs will be clear to those who think. And yet, this is sort of the response I had gotten. So I don't know, I just wanted to see how we can change some of that conversation.
That's excellent. Yes, and I did get feedback, even from a well-wisher, after watching my classes, that said, you shattered my Islam. Not in the sense of that they were disbelieving, but in their worldview, I had shattered it. I think that you do need to have your worldview shattered, and then you reconstruct it. That's what Muhammad Iqbal called to, the reconstruction of Islamic religious thought. And that's what Ghamidi Sahib has called to, the reconstruction of Islamic thought. So I think you do need to shatter your worldview. And some of your ideas are so firmly ingrained that you're so scared that your entire building is going to collapse and you'll never be able to rebuild it. That fear, I think we need to get past. Even when I was starting my PhD, I was dissuaded from some very prominent Islamic sheikh, you can probably guess who I'm on friendly terms with. He told me, you shouldn't do it, you might lose your faith. And this person struggled. They had certain crises in faith. I didn't have any crises in faith. The reason is my Islamic understanding is much more adaptable to the facts on the ground. So even when it comes to your question about bid'ah, I would say this. If you study, as I do, as a student of becoming a scholar of religion, I know that all religion is bid'ah. Like that's how, even the concept of bid'ah is bid'ah itself. There's hadith, like bid'ah is itself a bid'ah, just like there's no ijma about ijma. I mean, these are like truisms. So what I would say is that you need to be willing to go where the facts point you to, and if you do that, you'll be just fine. Your faith is, if you're scared of doing that, that's actually weakness in your faith, because you actually think that imagine, for example, this is a thought experiment. Imagine if you had a time machine, you had a DeLorean, you could go back in time and you could see if the Prophet Muhammad existed or not. Now, there are some Western scholars who have said that maybe Muhammad did not exist. Now that's a minority fringe idea, pretty much rejected overall. But imagine if you were fearful for your iman and you said, you know what, I'm not going to step into this time machine. That's actually a greater weakness, that you're so not sure of your faith that you're scared to match it up with reality. Me, I'm not scared. I can boldly go and say, you know what, none of this contradicts this. In fact, my studies have actually reinforced my faith and not destroyed my faith. So that's what I would say. And the way to approach it, I think the solution is Islamic academic theology. We are the ones who can push back and reconstruct it in this way. That's what I think.
Right. No, I would have to agree with you. I think my weakness was I had arrived at my own particular framework, which was tended toward the liberalism that you speak. And so I just had stopped listening to many of these folks and just did what I felt I needed to do. But what I would have liked, and I wish I'd had the time to pursue that. I started off wanting to pursue that and then went off, did other things, right? Is to have that body of knowledge, the tools, to really engage people in conversation and in discussion, and to do that pushback, when it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And so I think it's, again, I'm going back to it. We need to create those academic institutions, which is like a divinity school, a seminary. And by the way, that idea is not my idea. It goes back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who wanted to create Aligarh University. And he was successful in that as far as the sciences are concerned. But the religious ulema, the conservatives, forbade him to do it for the faculty of divinity that him and Aga Khan III wanted to create. And so it was an interdenominational faculty of divinity that they were thinking about all the way back then. This is more than 100 years, I think now, right? Yeah, more than 100 years. And this idea, it still needs to be fulfilled. Just creating one divinity school or this kind of seminary with this mission statement, I think could change things. Because once you pump out, what I said to Ghamidi Saab is, imagine if there were 20 of you. Like Ghamidi Saab himself takes down, he's like, if you put him on a weighing scale, he's probably like 10,000 mullahs put together. Like, imagine if you had 20 of them, we could win this. We could win this. So that's what I think we need. And we need to create institutions for that. And I can go, by the way, whoever needs to leave, please leave. This is just for whoever wants to stick around. This is kind of after hour. Junaid Saab, did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, I just had a comment regarding the sister. She mentioned about someone else saying that you could lose your faith. I can just share my own experience when I was reading Professor Nawal Hariri's books, Sapien and the other two follow-ups. A lot of people said to me that if you read these kind of books, you will lose your faith. And actually, I've had the opposite experience. Actually, the more I read that, I actually find it. Maybe it's the perspective that I read it with, but I actually find it otherwise. I actually find my faith to be more strengthened because I don't see it to be that weak. So I think we have to read, we have to learn, we have to understand these things, and let the facts go where they take us. And that's what the Quran keeps on saying. Look around you. So
I
this
agree with
quick
you.
comment.
I agree with you. Please.
Jawad, I know you probably mentioned this throughout the class, but I just wanted to know how exactly do you define Islamic reformism? Because even that term, I think, could sometimes be problematic amongst like pretty much a lot of Muslims. They would think that you're trying to reconstruct Islam altogether. So I just wanted to understand exactly what you mean by that term.
Sure. So I am of the view that we shouldn't be so picky about terms. I use a term in a specific way, and if somebody wants clarity, I'll say, look, this is the term I use. It has certain weaknesses, but let's not get stuck up on this issue. So that's the same thing with, do we call it Islamic philosophy, Muslim philosophy, philosophy in the Islamic world, Arabic philosophy? You could go on, and all of these have pluses and minuses. There's no way to pick a perfect word that would fit. So the same thing with reformism. Wahhabism could fall under reformism, and certain scholars do. I arbitrarily, and some scholars do this, I arbitrarily distinguish between reformism and revivalism. So, and this is arbitrary, you may not agree with it, but it's just a word that I use to put a category on something. And that, I think, is necessary for conceptual clarity so that we can actually know what we're talking about. So for me, reformism is the people who are on the more liberal side trying to go in that direction, modernist, basically. It's pretty synonymous with modernism for me. And then revivalism is the kind of Wahhabi side of it, where they're trying to go back to the past. So it's more reactionary. And so that's how I use these terms. But again, you can problematize it. That's how I use it. And then as far as one last thing I would just say is, I wouldn't shy away from what you said, personally, I'm saying, of that you are reconstructing it kind of from the ground up. But you're still using all the same parts. But if you don't reconstruct it from the ground up, I think your building is going to be faulty, because I think it's a systemic problem. I think the problem that I have with Islamic traditionalism and even Reform traditionalism is that they have a building that's not on good foundations. And so they're trying to just edge in this way. And what they have to do is they use legalism to solve a problem that's a moral philosophical problem. So for example, many Reform traditionalists who I appreciate, I like, who want to talk about slavery, they have to make arguments like this. They have to say that, well, practically speaking right now, we shouldn't take slaves because if we take slaves, they'll take us as slaves. For me, this is a horrible moral philosophical argument. We do thought experiments, right? What if the Islamic world becomes ascendant again? And this is what the Islamophobes accuse us of, that if we become ascendant again, we're going to start taking slaves again. This is horrible. We should say, no, morally, philosophically, slavery is wrong. And we can go back to the Quran, and we can see that the Quran, throughout its text, is saying to free slaves and marry slaves. And even there's certain verses that can be taken in an abolitionist way. I do believe in being intellectually honest, right? I'm not saying that I'm not one of those people who reads back into things. You'll see that I'm like, no, we can. I'm a person who says we do have to take the text and contextualize it and do the double movement that Fazl Rahman talks about. So that's what I would say on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Omar. I appreciate it. All right. I think we'll call it a day. We've gone very long. So who knows how much of that is going to go on the YouTube or not. That might be the Khas people who are talking. So privately, maybe. All right. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much for this excellent discussion and all your feedback. Thank you very much.